Today, I've prepared the biography of Harriet Tubman. Before you fall asleep, make sure to tell us from where you're listening and what time it is. Now, calm down and listen to the story while falling asleep. I'm wishing you a cozy and comfortable night. As you settle into your bed, pulling the covers up just right, let your mind drift back to a different time. Tonight, we'll be exploring the remarkable journey of Harriet Tubman, whose courage and determination changed the course of American history. Her story is one of extraordinary bravery, unwavering hope, and profound compassion. As your breathing slows and your muscles relax, allow yourself to be gently carried into the world of this remarkable woman, born into slavery, yet destined to become one of our greatest freedom fighters. The soft rhythm of my voice will guide you through her inspiring life as you drift peacefully toward slumber. In the gentle quiet of a long ago time, beneath the vast Maryland skies, a small child named Araminta Ross came into this world. The year was around 1822. Though no one kept precise records of enslaved children's births, the air would have been crisp and cool as winter prepared to settle across the eastern shore of Maryland, where the Brodess plantation stretched across the landscape. This child, who would one day be known to the world as Harriet Tubman, began her life in the humblest of circumstances. Cradled in the loving arms of her mother, Harriet Green. Rit Green was a woman of remarkable strength, both in body and spirit. She worked in the main house of the plantation, her hands always busy with cooking, cleaning, and tending to the needs of others, while her heart remained firmly connected to her growing family. Harriet's father, Ben Ross, was a skilled timber worker who knew the secrets of the forests that surrounded their home. He could read the direction of the wind in the rustling leaves and find his way through the densest woods by the patterns of moss on tree trunks. These skills, passed down to young Araminta in whispered lessons during precious moments together, would one day guide her through hundreds of miles of dangerous territory. The Ross family lived in a small, simple cabin that stood at the edge of the plantation property. Inside, the earthen floor was swept smooth each day, and a small hearth provided warmth and a place to cook their modest meals. At night, the children would gather close to hear stories told in hushed tones, some from the Bible, which was forbidden to them, but which they treasured nonetheless, and others from the rich oral traditions carried from Africa. The soft glow of firelight would illuminate their faces as they listened, wide-eyed, to tales of courage and perseverance. Young Araminta, or Minty, as she was affectionately called, was one of 9 children born to Rit and Ben. The family bonds were strong despite the constant threat of separation that haunted enslaved families. Each morning, as the first light of dawn filtered through the cracks in their cabin walls, Minty would awaken to the sound of her mother humming spirituals as she prepared for another day of labor. These songs with their double meanings of earthly suffering and heavenly redemption, would become the soundtrack of Minty's childhood and later. The coded messages of her freedom missions, the Maryland landscape that surrounded the young girl, was a tapestry of contrasts. Fields of tobacco and corn stretched toward the horizon, requiring backbreaking labor from sunrise to sunset. Beyond these cultivated lands lay dense forests and winding waterways that would later become pathways to freedom. The Choptank River flowed nearby, its currents carrying boats laden with goods for trade, while also serving as a boundary marker between counties, and in Minty's imagination, between bondage and liberty. As a young child, Minty was often hired out to neighboring families, separated from her parents and siblings for months at a time. When she was around 5 or 6 years old, she was sent to work for a woman named Miss Susan, who tasked the small child with watching her baby. If the infant cried and Minty couldn't quiet it, she would be whipped. The gentle sway of the cradle, the soft lullabies she would sing, and the vigilant attention she maintained were early lessons in responsibility and care, though they came at a terrible price for one so young. In these early years, Minty also learned to weave and mend fishing nets, her small fingers working deftly with the coarse twine. She would sit by the water's edge, the rhythmic motion of her hands accompanied by the gentle lapping of waves against the shore and the distant calls of waterfowl. The changing seasons marked the passage of time. The soft green buds of spring, the heavy humidity of summer, the golden hues of autumn, and the stark beauty of winter, when the landscape was transformed into a canvas of white and gray. When Minty was around 7 years old, she was sent to work for a planter named James Cook, who assigned her to check muskrat traps in the cold waters of the marshes. Wading through the chilly waters in all seasons, she developed pneumonia, which weakened her young body, but could not diminish her spirit. During this time, she learned to read the natural world, the patterns of animal movements, the changing tides, and the stars that would one day guide her northward. Perhaps the most formative event of Minty's childhood occurred when she was around 13 years old. While at a dry goods store with her master, she encountered an enslaved man who had left his field without permission. The overseer demanded that Minty help restrain the man, but she refused. In a moment of chaos, the overseer threw a 2-pound weight that struck Minty in the head. The injury nearly killed her and left her with a lifetime of sleeping spells, sudden episodes of unconsciousness that would come upon her without warning. During her recovery, which took many months, Minty began to experience vivid dreams and visions. She believed these were messages from God, guiding her toward her destiny. As she lay on her simple pallet, drifting between wakefulness and sleep, the sounds of the household would fade into the background, the crackle of the fire, the soft murmurs of conversation, the distant barking of dogs. In these quiet moments, her inner strength began to take shape, forged in the crucible of suffering. The spiritual life of the enslaved community provided both solace and strength during these difficult years. In hidden clearings deep in the woods, away from the watchful eyes of overseers, they would gather for prayer meetings. The soft chorus of voices rising in harmony, singing of rivers and chariots and sweet freedom, created a sense of unity and hope that transcended their daily hardships. Young Minty absorbed these teachings deeply, developing a faith that would sustain her through unimaginable challenges. As Minty grew into adolescence, the rhythms of plantation life continued around her. The seasons dictated the work, planting in spring, tending in summer, harvesting in fall, and maintenance in winter. The air would be filled with different scents throughout the year. The fresh turned earth, the sweet fragrance of ripening fruit, the smoke from autumn bonfires, and the clean crispness of winter mornings. These sensory memories would remain with her always, connecting her to this place even after she had left it far behind. The Brodes plantation was not isolated from the larger currents of history. Whispered conversations among the adults spoke of changes in the world beyond. The growing tensions between North and South, the stories of successful escapes, and the network of helpers known as the Underground Railroad. Young Minty listened carefully to these discussions, storing away information that would one day prove vital. The concept of freedom, though abstract, began to take root in her consciousness like a seed waiting for the right conditions to grow. Around 1844, Araminta married a free black man named John Tubman. Little is known about their courtship, but one can imagine quiet conversations during rare moments of rest, perhaps sitting beneath a spreading oak tree on a Sunday afternoon, their voices low and intimate as they shared dreams of a different life. Marriage did not change Minty's legal status. She remained enslaved while her husband was free, creating a precarious situation that highlighted the cruel contradictions of the system. It was during this time that Araminta began to call herself Harriet, taking her mother's name as her own in a quiet act of self-determination. This simple change, this choosing of identity, was perhaps her first step toward claiming her freedom. The name Harriet means ruler of the home, an ironic title for a woman who legally had no rights to herself, let alone a household, but one that would prove prophetic in time. Life on the eastern shore of Maryland in the 1840s was changing. Economic pressures were causing some slaveholders to sell their human property to traders who would take them to the Deep South, where conditions were known to be even more brutal. The threat of being sold away from family and community hung over Harriet and her loved ones like a storm cloud. When Edward Brodes died in 1849, leaving behind considerable debt, that threat became immediate and real. In the autumn of that year, with rumors spreading that she and her brothers would be sold, Harriet made the momentous decision to flee. The details of her first escape are not fully known, but we can imagine her heart pounding as she slipped away under cover of darkness. Perhaps on a moonless night when the stars shone with particular brightness, the same stars that had watched over her childhood now guided her steps toward freedom. Harriet's early life had prepared her in unexpected ways for this journey. Her father had taught her to navigate by the stars and to recognize edible plants in the forest. Her time checking muskrat traps had shown her how to move quietly through water and marsh. Her injury and subsequent sleeping spells, while debilitating, had taught her to listen to her intuition and to trust in divine guidance. Even the songs she had learned as a child now served a practical purpose. Their coded lyrics containing instructions and warnings for those brave enough to seek freedom. The Maryland of Harriet's childhood was a place of contradictions. Beautiful landscapes marred by human cruelty, close family bonds threatened by arbitrary separation, and a system that claimed Christian values while denying the humanity of those it enslaved. Yet within this difficult environment, the seeds of extraordinary courage and compassion were planted in a young girl who would grow to become one of America's most revered heroes. As we reflect on Harriet Tubman's formative years, we see how each experience, each hardship, and each small joy contributed to the woman she would become. The child who once watched over another's baby would grow to guide dozens of people to freedom. The girl who learned to read the stars would navigate the perilous route north time and again. The young woman who chose her own name would help others claim their identities as free people. The gentle breezes that once rustled through the trees of her Maryland home would be replaced by the winds of change that she herself helped to set in motion. The quiet strength that developed during those early years would sustain her through dangers and challenges that most would find unimaginable, and the deep faith that took root in her childhood would blossom into a conviction that would inspire generations to come. As night deepens and our thoughts grow quiet, we might imagine young Harriet gazing up at the same stars that shine above us now, dreaming of a future she could barely envision, but somehow knew was possible. In that shared moment across time, we find connection with a remarkable spirit whose journey began in the humblest of circumstances, but whose legacy continues to illuminate our understanding of courage, freedom, and the enduring power of hope. Let us drift further into the story as we explore the next part of this fascinating journey. In the quiet darkness of the early 19th century, in a small cabin nestled among the tall pines of Dorchester County, Maryland, a baby girl was born to Ben and Harriet Ross. They named her Araminta, though the world would later come to know her as Harriet Tubman. As you rest and allow your mind to drift backward through time, imagine the soft crackling of the hearth fire, the whispered conversations, and the gentle lullabies that filled the air around baby Araminta's earliest days. The Ross family's roots stretched deep into the rich soil of the eastern shore of Maryland, a land of tidal marshes, winding creeks, and forests that seemed to whisper ancient secrets. Harriet's maternal grandmother, Modesty, had arrived on these shores from Africa, brought against her will across the vast Atlantic. As you breathe deeply and settle more comfortably, picture Modesty's face in the firelight, her eyes holding stories of a homeland across the ocean, stories she would pass down to her daughter Harriet, who would in turn share them with young Araminta. These stories flowed like a river through generations, carrying with them the memories of ancestors who had lived freely in Africa before the terrible disruption of slavery. They spoke of communities where people lived in harmony with the natural world, where elders were respected for their wisdom, and where the rhythms of daily life were marked by rituals and celebrations that honored both the earth and the spirits that watched over it. Ben Ross, Araminta's father, was known throughout the region for his remarkable knowledge of the forests. He could read the woods like others read books, understanding which plants could heal, which could harm, and how to navigate using only the stars and natural landmarks as guides. This wisdom wasn't learned from books, but was passed from father to son, mother to daughter, elder to child, in an unbroken chain of knowledge that stretched back through countless generations. As you allow your body to grow heavier and more relaxed, imagine young Araminta walking slowly beside her father through the dappled forest light, learning to identify trees by their bark, leaves, and the particular way they swayed in the wind. Ben would point to the North Star, explaining how it remained fixed in the heavens, while other stars appeared to circle around it. This knowledge, shared in quiet moments between father and daughter, would one day guide Araminta, by then known as Harriet, as she led people to freedom along the Underground Railroad. The Ross family, though enslaved, maintained a strong sense of identity and dignity. They preserved African traditions in their cooking, their music, their storytelling, and their spiritual practices. The rhythm of hand-clapping games played by children echoed the drumbeats of their ancestors. The recipes for healing teas and poultices contained wisdom carried across the ocean. The spirituals sung during rare moments of rest blended Christian imagery with African musical traditions, creating something new yet connected to the past. Harriet's mother, also named Harriet, was known for her strength and fierce protection of her children. She had 9 children in all, and despite the hardships of enslavement, she fought to keep her family together. When a slave trader attempted to buy one of her sons, she hid him and confronted the would-be buyer with such determination that he eventually abandoned his efforts. This courage flowed in the family bloodline, a quiet resistance passed from mother to daughter. As your eyelids grow heavier, picture the Ross family gathered together in their small cabin after a long day of work. Despite their exhaustion, they found moments to share stories, to sing softly, and to teach their children about their heritage. They spoke in coded language about freedom, using biblical stories about Moses leading his people out of bondage as a way to keep hope alive without alerting those who might punish such dangerous talk. Family traditions helped mark the passage of time and preserved a sense of continuity. Special foods might be prepared for celebrations when possible. Small handmade gifts were exchanged. Knowledge of herbal remedies and midwifery passed from grandmother to mother to daughter. These traditions served as anchors in lives that were otherwise controlled by others. Small assertions of humanity and connection in a system designed to deny both. The extended family network spread across several plantations in the area, creating a web of relationships that provided support and maintained connections. Cousins, aunts, uncles, and grandparents might only see each other occasionally, perhaps at Sunday gatherings or holiday times when owners sometimes permitted visits. These precious moments of family reunion were treasured. Opportunities to update one another on births, deaths, and other significant events, to share news and information, and to simply enjoy the comfort of being among kin as you drift deeper towards sleep. Imagine the sounds of these gatherings: soft laughter, the murmur of many voices in conversation, perhaps the gentle strumming of a handmade instrument, the shuffle of feet in dance steps learned long ago and far away. These were moments when the weight of enslavement might briefly lift, when joy could find space to bloom like wildflowers pushing through cracks in hard ground. Young Aramintu absorbed these experiences like a sponge, her identity forming from this rich mixture of African heritage, family bonds, Christian faith, and the particular culture that enslaved African Americans had created to survive and find meaning despite their circumstances. She learned early the importance of community, of helping others, of finding ways to resist that wouldn't bring harm to those she loved. The landscape itself became part of her heritage. The marshy woodlands of the eastern shore, with their hiding places and secret paths, would later serve her well. The rivers and streams that flowed through the region became metaphors in the spirituals she sang. The Jordan River representing the boundary between slavery and freedom, the promised land waiting on the other shore. The changing seasons taught patience, and the certainty that difficult times would eventually yield to better days. When Aramintu was still young, her father was granted freedom by his owner's will, though he continued to work as a timber inspector and forest manager. This created a complicated family situation: a free father with an enslaved wife and children. Ben saved money when he could, hoping to someday purchase his family's freedom. But the economics of slavery made this nearly impossible. Still, his status as a free black man showed young Aramintu that another way of living was possible, that freedom wasn't just a distant dream, but something that could be achieved. The spiritual life of the family provided another source of strength and identity. Faith practices blended Christian teachings with African spiritual traditions. God was understood as deeply concerned with justice and freedom, as a liberator who heard the cries of the oppressed. Prayer wasn't just a quiet personal practice, but a communal experience, often expressed through song, movement, and emotional expression. These worship experiences created space for both lament and hope, acknowledging present suffering while affirming the possibility of deliverance. As your breathing becomes slower and deeper, imagine Araminta sitting beside her mother, learning to sew by the light of a single candle. The stitches connected pieces of cloth, just as stories connected pieces of family history. Perhaps her mother spoke of grandparents and great-grandparents, of traditions from the old country, of family traits that appeared generation after generation. A certain way of laughing, a talent for music, a stubborn determination that couldn't be broken. Food traditions formed another important thread in the family's cultural tapestry. Despite limited resources, meals were prepared with care, seasoned with herbs grown in small garden patches, and served with dignity. Recipes were taught by demonstration rather than written down, the knowledge living in hands that had performed the same motions countless times before. Special dishes marked holidays and celebrations. Sweet potato pies, cornbread, greens seasoned with a small piece of salt pork, stews that could feed many from little. The natural world provided both sustenance and medicine. The Ross family, like many enslaved families, supplemented their meager rations by fishing, gathering wild foods, and sometimes hunting small game when possible. They knew which plants could ease a fever, which could help a wound heal, which could settle a troubled stomach. This knowledge represented another form of resistance, a way to care for themselves and each other outside the control of those who claimed to own them. Language itself carried cultural heritage. While enslaved people were required to speak English, many preserved words, expressions, and speech patterns from African languages. Names held special significance, often honoring ancestors or expressing hopes for a child's future. When Araminta later chose to be called Harriet, taking her mother's name and her husband's surname, it represented both a connection to her roots and a step toward self-determination. As night deepens around you, consider how these family influences shaped the woman who would become Harriet Tubman. The courage she witnessed in her mother's protection of her children, the knowledge of the natural world she learned from her father, the spiritual conviction that God intended freedom for all people, the understanding that family bonds transcended the artificial boundaries imposed by slavery, the cultural heritage that provided tools for survival, resistance, and maintaining human dignity in dehumanizing circumstances. The stars that Ben Ross pointed out to his daughter would eventually guide her on journeys north, leading others to freedom. The herbs her mother and grandmother taught her to use for healing would tend to the sick and injured she encountered. The spirituals sung around evening fires would become coded messages about escape routes and safe houses. The determination that ran in the family bloodline would sustain her through dangers and setbacks that would have defeated someone with less resolve. Family stories told of distant relatives who had escaped slavery, disappearing into the night to make their way north toward freedom. These tales were whispered, never spoken loudly, but they planted seeds of possibility in young minds. If others had found their way to freedom, perhaps they could too. If there were people willing to help strangers on dangerous journeys, perhaps a broader human family existed beyond the boundaries of their current experience. As your thoughts grow ever more gentle and your body settles towards sleep, imagine the night sky above the eastern shore in the early 1800s, free from modern light pollution, the stars brilliantly clear against the darkness. Somewhere beneath that vast canopy, a young girl named Araminta is also looking up, perhaps saying her prayers, perhaps dreaming of a different life, not yet knowing that she will one day be known around the world as Harriet Tubman, conductor on the Underground Railroad, scout for the Union Army, suffragist, and humanitarian. The seeds of all she would become were already present, planted by her family, nurtured by her culture, rooted in the soil of her ancestral heritage. As she slept beneath those stars, the future was still unwritten, but the foundations of her remarkable life were being laid in the quiet strength of family bonds, in stories told and retold, in skills passed from hand to hand, and in the unquenchable hope that freedom was not just a dream, but a birthright that no human being could rightfully take from another. And as you drift toward your own peaceful sleep, perhaps you carry with you a deeper appreciation for how our ancestors shape us, how cultural roots sustain us, and how family stories become part of who we are, flowing through generations like a river that connects past, present, and future in one continuous, life-giving stream. The peaceful narrative of this life continues as we turn our attention to what happened next. In the gentle embrace of the early 19th century, along the eastern shore of Maryland, a world unfolds where a young girl named Araminta Ross, who would one day be known as Harriet Tubman, opened her eyes each morning to a landscape of contradictions. The air there carried the sweet scent of pine, mixed with the brackish aroma of tidal marshes, a constant reminder of the meeting between land and water that characterized this corner of the Chesapeake Bay region. The skies stretched endlessly above the flat terrain, painted in watercolor hues of dawn pink and twilight purple, offering both beauty and the promise of a world beyond the boundaries that contained her. Araminta's earliest days unfolded on the Anthony Thompson plantation in Dorchester County, where her parents, Harriet Ritt Green and Benjamin Ross, lived and worked in bondage. The plantation rested on land that whispered stories of the native Choptank and Nanticoke peoples who had once moved freely across these same meadows and forests. Now, it was a patchwork of agricultural fields, dotted with wooden structures that housed those who worked the land not by choice, but by force. The family's cabin was humble, a simple wooden structure with gaps between the planks that let in both light and the chill of winter winds. The dirt floor beneath their feet connected them directly to the earth, and in summer, it would cool their bare souls after long days of labor. A small hearth served as both cooking space and the cabin's heart, where family would gather as daylight faded, sharing warmth, stories, and the quiet comfort of being together despite circumstances designed to pull them apart. Inside this modest shelter, the air carried a tapestry of scents: cornbread baking in the coals, the earthy aroma of root vegetables, the lingering scent of pine needles used to sweeten the air, and the faint trace of herbs hanging to dry from the low ceiling beams. These familiar fragrances formed the backdrop of Araminta's earliest memories, creating a sensory map of home that she would carry with her throughout her remarkable life. The rhythms of daily existence were dictated by the rising and setting of the sun, by the turning of seasons, and by the demands of agricultural life. Dawn would break with birdsong, the melodic trilling of eastern bluebirds, the distinctive call of red-winged blackbirds from nearby marshes, and the gentle cooing of mourning doves. These natural alarms would stir the plantation to life, calling workers from their beds before the first rays of sunlight touched the horizon. For Araminta's family, mornings began in the blue-black darkness before dawn. Her mother would kindle the hearth fire, its orange glow illuminating tired faces as they prepared for another day of labor. The simple breakfast of cornmeal mush might be sweetened with a precious spoonful of molasses on special days. The rich, dark sweetness, a rare luxury. Family members would eat quickly, sometimes in silence, sometimes sharing quiet words or prayers before dispersing to their assigned tasks. The landscape that surrounded young Araminta was a complex tapestry of natural beauty and human hardship. Dorchester County presented a varied terrain of pine forests, open fields, and wetlands that shifted and changed with the tides. The Chesapeake region's waterways, rivers, creeks, and the bay itself created a network of blue veins running through the land, sometimes barriers, sometimes pathways to elsewhere. These waters would later become crucial knowledge in Harriet's work as a conductor on the Underground Railroad. But as a child, they were simply part of the world she observed with keen, curious eyes. The forests were places of both danger and sanctuary. Tall loblolly pines reached skyward, their needle-covered branches creating a canopy that filtered sunlight into dappled patterns on the forest floor. Oak, hickory, and gum trees added diversity to the woodlands, their leaves rustling in summer breezes and creating a gentle soundtrack to accompany the occasional calls of woodpeckers and the distant cry of hawks circling overhead. In these woods, Araminta learned to move quietly, to observe the habits of animals, to recognize plants that could heal and those that could harm, knowledge that would one day help her guide others to freedom. The marshlands offered another dimension to her world, with their tall grasses swaying in the wind, creating a whispering sound like secrets being shared. These wetlands teemed with life, blue herons standing statue, still as they hunted, turtles sunning themselves on fallen logs, and frogs whose evening chorus created a natural symphony as day transitioned to night. The mud of these marshes left its mark on bare feet and clothing, a reminder of the earth's claim on those who walked upon it. The changing seasons painted this landscape in different hues and textures. Spring brought dogwood and redbud blossoms, dotting the forest edges with white and pink. Summer dressed the fields in green and gold, the crops growing under the watchful eye of overseers. Autumn tinged the world in amber and crimson as leaves surrendered to the cycle of life, and winter stripped the trees bare, revealing the stark architecture of branches against gray skies. Each season brought its own challenges and small joys, its own particular quality of light that Aramintu observed and internalized. Within this physical environment, the social world of Araminta's childhood was equally complex. The plantation system created rigid hierarchies and painful separations. Yet, within these constraints, the enslaved community built networks of support, love, and resistance that sustained them through unimaginable hardship. For Araminta, family formed the core of this social universe, with her parents creating a foundation of love, despite the precarious nature of enslaved family bonds. Her mother, Rit, was known for her fierce determination to keep her family together, fighting against the threat of having her children sold away. This maternal courage would later echo in Harriet's own fierce protection of others. From Rit, young Araminta learned the power of storytelling, absorbing tales that connected her to an African heritage that predated slavery, narratives that carried wisdom across oceans and generations. In the evenings, by the dim light of the hearth or a precious candle, these stories would unfold in Rit's voice, painting pictures of places and people Araminta had never seen but somehow recognized in her soul. Her father, Ben Ross, worked as a timber inspector and forester, roles that required specialized knowledge and allowed him some limited mobility within the confines of enslavement. From him, Araminta learned practical skills of survival in the woods, how to navigate by stars, how to read the landscape, how to find food and water in seemingly inhospitable environments. These lessons were taught not as formal education, but through observation and experience, knowledge passing from father to daughter through shared work and whispered guidance. The extended community of enslaved people on neighboring plantations created a wider social circle, connected through kinship, shared labor, and the solace of religious gatherings. On rare occasions when work ceased, typically Sunday afternoons, people might gather for brief social interactions, sharing news, music, and the comfort of collective prayer. These gatherings often took place in woodland clearings or remote cabins, away from the controlling gaze of overseers and enslavers. It was in these gatherings that Araminta first encountered the spiritual traditions that would sustain her throughout her life. The religious expression of enslaved communities blended African spiritual practices with Christian teachings, creating a faith that spoke directly to their experience and promised liberation. If not in this world, then in the next. Hymns sung in hushed voices carried coded messages of resistance and hope, their melodies rising and falling like the tidal waters of the Chesapeake. The natural rhythm of these songs, sometimes accompanied by hand clapping or makeshift instruments, created a heartbeat for the community, synchronizing individual suffering into collective strength. Young Araminta absorbed these rhythms, these melodies, these words of faith and freedom, letting them sink deep into her being, where they would later fuel her courage during the darkest nights of her journeys north. The social environment also included painful interactions with those who claimed ownership over human beings. Araminta witnessed and experienced firsthand the casual cruelty of the slave system, including a traumatic head injury inflicted by an overseer that would cause her to experience seizures and vivid dreams throughout her life. These dreams she would later interpret as divine messages, guiding her actions in bringing others to freedom. Daily life for young Araminta included labor appropriate to her age and strength, which increased as she grew. Initially, she might be assigned to domestic tasks or childcare, looking after the children of others, while their parents worked in fields or workshops. Later, she would be hired out to neighboring households, experiencing separation from her family and exposure to different forms of treatment, some harsher than others. These early experiences of being moved from place to place, of adapting to new surroundings and authority figures, developed in her a resilience and adaptability that would serve her mission in adulthood. The physical labor of plantation life shaped Araminta's body and spirit from an early age. The repetitive motions of agricultural work, the bending, lifting, carrying, built strength in her small frame. The discipline required to work from sunrise to sunset, regardless of weather conditions or physical discomfort, forged in her an endurance that few could match. These qualities, born of hardship, would one day enable her to walk through winter nights, to ford rivers, to climb mountains, all while guiding others toward the North Star and freedom. Even as a child, Araminta demonstrated an unusual determination and sense of justice. Stories tell of her willingness to accept punishment rather than participate in actions she deemed wrong, of her early recognition of the fundamental injustice of slavery itself. This moral clarity, nurtured perhaps by her parents' example and the spiritual teachings of her community, would become the compass guiding her remarkable future. As twilight descended on the eastern shore, the landscape transformed yet again. The golden light of sunset gave way to deepening blue, then to the velvet darkness of rural nights, untouched by artificial illumination. Stars emerged one by one, then in clusters, until the sky above was carpeted with their distant light. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a river of stars, its path seeming to point northward toward freedom. In these quiet evening hours, as work finally ceased and bodies sought rest, the social bonds of family and community found their deepest expression. Exhausted from labor, but nourished by connection, people would share the small comforts available to them. A story, a song, a prayer, the gentle touch of a loved one's hand. Children might be lulled to sleep with whispered lullabies, their dreams perhaps carrying them to places their waking bodies could not go. For young Araminta, these nights beneath the star-filled sky planted seeds of possibility. The North Star, steadfast and unwavering, offered a constant reminder that there was a direction that led away from bondage, a path that others had taken before her. The stories she heard of those who had escaped, who had followed that star to freedom, nestled in her consciousness, alongside her mother's tales and her father's woodland wisdom, creating a foundation for the woman she would become. The physical and social environment of Araminta's childhood, the landscape with its forests and waterways, the cabin with its hearth and humble comforts, the community with its bonds of love and shared suffering, all became part of her. The skills she learned, the strength she developed, the moral clarity she cultivated, the faith she embraced. These were not separate from the environment that shaped her, but woven from the same threads. As the night deepens and your own thoughts grow quiet, imagine young Araminta finally at rest, her eyes closed, but her spirit alert even in sleep, absorbing lessons from the world around her, preparing unconsciously for a future she could not yet imagine. The same stars that watched over her childhood continue their timeless journey across our sky, connecting us to her story across the distance of years, reminding us that the seeds of extraordinary lives are often planted in the most ordinary of circumstances, nurtured by the quiet influence of place and people, waiting for the right moment to grow toward the light of possibility. As you relax deeper, let us now softly explore the next chapter of this soothing biography. In the quiet depths of enslavement, formal education was a forbidden fruit for young Araminta, who would later be known to the world as Harriet Tubman. Her schooling came not from books or classrooms, but from the gentle whispers of experience and observation, from the soft rustling of leaves and the patient flow of rivers. As you rest now, letting your body sink deeper into comfort, allow yourself to drift alongside the story of how this remarkable woman's mind was shaped. Like water slowly carving its path through stone, the plantation where Araminta spent her early years offered no traditional learning. Slave owners deliberately kept literacy from those they enslaved, fearing the power of the written word, the dangerous freedom that comes with reading and writing instead of alphabets and arithmetic. Araminta learned to read the weather from the movement of clouds, to understand seasons from the behavior of animals, to measure time by the position of the sun. These were practical lessons, necessary for survival, taught not in hushed schoolrooms, but in fields under the watchful eye of overseers. Her father, Ben Ross, was a skilled woodsman who worked primarily in the timber industry during rare moments together. He would show his daughter how to navigate through the dense Maryland forests. Imagine them now, moving quietly between tall trees, his voice low and soothing as he pointed out which moss grows on the north side of trees, how certain stars remain fixed in the night sky, which plants could heal and which could harm. These weren't merely survival skills, but an education in observation, in paying attention to the smallest details, in understanding that knowledge often lies in the quietest corners of our world. From her mother, Rit Green, Araminta absorbed stories, tales passed down through generations, narratives of ancestors who had crossed oceans against their will, but carried cultural wisdom in their memories. These stories weren't just entertainment, but education, teaching moral lessons, preserving history, explaining the world. As you breathe deeply now, picture young Araminta by the dim light of evening, her mother's voice a gentle stream of words, filling her imagination with characters who overcame impossible odds, with trickster figures who outwitted those more powerful, with heroes who maintained dignity even when dignity was denied them. The spiritual education Araminta received came through the secret religious gatherings slaves would hold away from their master's supervision. In these meetings, often held deep in woods or swamps, biblical stories were shared orally. Spirituals were sung with voices kept just loud enough to reach each other, but not alert others to their forbidden assembly. The story of Moses leading his people out of bondage in Egypt resonated deeply with Araminta, planting seeds that would later bloom into her own mission of deliverance. The concept that God was on the side of the oppressed, that freedom was a divine right, that one person could lead many to liberation. These ideas settled into her consciousness like gentle rain into fertile soil when Araminta was still quite young, perhaps around 5 or 6 years old. She was sent to work in the home of a neighboring plantation owner. There, her education continued in unexpected ways. Assigned to care for an infant, she was beaten when the baby cried, and she couldn't quiet it. From this harsh experience, she learned about injustice, about the arbitrary nature of punishment, about the need to anticipate the moods and demands of those who held power. These were bitter lessons, absorbed not in the peaceful environment learning deserves, but in moments of fear and pain. Later, she was sent to work checking muskrat traps in marshes. Picture her wading through cold water in winter, her small frame shivering, learning the patience required to check traps. The attention to detail needed to reset them properly. The geography of waterways and the habits of animals, the marshlands became another classroom, teaching her about endurance, about moving through difficult terrain, about finding paths where others saw only obstacles. As a young teenager, Araminta was transferred to field work. The overseer, seeing her small but strong, assigned her to drive oxen, to plow, to split rails. These were tasks usually given to men, but Araminta's physical strength was becoming apparent. Working alongside adults, she absorbed their conversations, their coded language, their subtle forms of resistance. She learned which overseers might look away at crucial moments, which fellow slaves could be trusted with secrets, which white people showed small kindnesses that hinted at different beliefs about humanity. Around the age of 13, Araminta experienced a defining moment in her intellectual development. She witnessed another slave attempting to escape. The overseer demanded she help restrain him. She refused. In his rage, he threw a heavy metal weight that struck Araminta's head, cracking her skull. This injury would cause her to experience sudden episodes of sleep throughout her life, a condition we might now identify as narcolepsy or epilepsy. But it also triggered something else, vivid dreams and visions that she interpreted as communications from God. As you drift deeper toward sleep, consider how this injury, this trauma, became integrated into Araminta's understanding of the world. The line between dreaming and waking became permeable for her. She developed a rich interior life where spiritual visions offered guidance, where God spoke directly to her soul. This wasn't a simple matter of religious belief, but a complex reshaping of consciousness, a different way of processing information and making decisions. Her injury became not just a disability, but a different ability, a unique lens through which to view reality. In her late teens and early 20s, Araminta was hired out to work for various masters. This arrangement gave her slightly more mobility, exposing her to different environments and people. During this period, she likely encountered free Black people, hearing their stories, observing how they navigated a world that recognized their legal personhood, even while restricting their rights. She may have met sailors and dock workers who carried news from northern states, and even from abroad, whispering about abolition movements, about countries where slavery had been outlawed, about communities of escaped slaves living in freedom. When Araminta married John Tubman around 1844, her education expanded through their relationship. John was a free Black man, and through him, she gained insights into the complex social structure of pre-Civil War Maryland, where free and enslaved Black people lived side by side, their lives interconnected, yet fundamentally different. The practical knowledge of how free Black people obtained papers, found work, established homes. These details were crucial information that she stored away, building a mental map of possibilities. Throughout these years, Araminta was developing not just knowledge, but wisdom. The ability to assess situations quickly, to make decisions under pressure, to read people's intentions, to plan several steps ahead. She was cultivating patience, the understanding that sometimes one must wait for the right moment, that timing can be as important as action itself. She was building courage, not the absence of fear, but the determination to act despite fear, to move forward even when the path ahead was shrouded in uncertainty. In 1849, hearing rumors that she and her brothers might be sold to the Deep South, Araminta made the momentous decision to escape. By this time, she had assembled an informal education that prepared her in ways no conventional schooling could have. She knew the terrain, understood the patterns of pursuit, had developed networks of potential allies, had cultivated the physical stamina needed for long journeys on foot, had honed the mental fortitude required to maintain hope in desperate circumstances. Her escape to Philadelphia was not just a physical journey, but an intellectual one. Imagine her first experiences of a city where Black people moved freely on the streets, where abolitionists held public meetings, where newspapers openly discussed the moral wrongs of slavery. Picture her absorbing this new reality, recalibrating her understanding of what was possible, expanding her vision of freedom beyond personal liberty to encompass the liberation of others. In Philadelphia, Harriet, as she now called herself, taking her mother's name and her husband's surname, found mentors in the abolitionist community. William Still, a freeborn Black man who coordinated underground railroad activities in Philadelphia, shared practical knowledge about safe houses, supportive families, and routes north. Frederick Douglass, the renowned escaped slave and orator, may have influenced her thinking about how to articulate the evils of slavery to those who had never experienced it. Lucretia Mott, the Quaker abolitionist and women's rights advocate, demonstrated how one could integrate spiritual conviction with political action. As you feel sleep approaching, gentle and welcoming, consider how Harriet Tubman's mind continued to develop even as an adult. She learned to navigate by stars, not just as a woodcraft skill, but as a method of finding her way north during rescue missions. She studied train schedules to time her movements, learned to disguise herself in various ways, developed codes and signals to communicate secretly with those she was helping. She became adept at raising funds from sympathetic Northerners, articulating the urgency of her work without revealing operational details that could compromise safety. During the Civil War, Tubman's intellectual growth continued as she served the Union Army as a scout, spy, and nurse. She learned about military operations, about treating wounds and diseases, about gathering intelligence. She worked with generals and soldiers, with contrabands, escaped slaves who sought refuge with Union forces, and freed people establishing new lives. Each experience added to her understanding of the complex social and political landscape of America in transformation. In her later years, Tubman became involved with the women's suffrage movement, expanding her concept of freedom to include political representation. She worked alongside educated, privileged white women like Susan B. Anthony, bringing her lived experience to theoretical discussions about rights and citizenship. Though she remained illiterate throughout her life, she dictated her stories to others, ensuring that her knowledge would be preserved and shared. The education of Harriet Tubman reminds us that learning happens in many ways, that wisdom can grow even in the harshest circumstances, that the human mind seeks understanding even when formal education is denied. As you drift now toward sleep, let Tubman's journey from enslaved child to American hero remind you of our remarkable capacity for growth, for adaptation, for finding light even in the darkest places. Her story whispers to us across time that education is not merely what we are taught, but what we observe, what we question, what we imagine, and ultimately, what we do with the knowledge we gather along the winding path of our lives. Our soothing biography continues with a look at the next important period in this incredible life. Harriet Tubman's life was shaped by the quiet strength of those who walked beside her, people who, in their own ways, became guiding stars in the darkness of slavery and struggle. Some were family, others strangers who became kin through shared purpose, and still others were figures of history whose names we still remember today. Each left an imprint on her heart. Each taught her something essential about survival, courage, and the unyielding belief in freedom. Her first and deepest influences were her parents, Ben and Harriet Ross, who instilled in her the resilience she would carry through every hardship. Her father, a skilled woodsman, taught her how to read the land, how to follow the North Star, how to move silently through the forests, how to listen for the sounds of danger. These lessons would one day save countless lives on the Underground Railroad. Her mother, Rit, passed down stories of their ancestors, of West African traditions and spiritual beliefs that whispered of protection and resistance. Even in the brutal reality of slavery, they gave her a sense of identity, a quiet pride that could not be taken from her. There was also her husband, John Tubman, though their paths would later diverge. In her youth, he was a free black man, and their marriage gave Harriet her first glimpse of a life beyond bondage. Though he would not join her when she escaped, choosing instead to remain in Maryland. Their time together planted the seed of possibility in her mind. The knowledge that freedom existed, that it could be claimed, would not leave her. Perhaps one of the most profound influences in Harriet's life was the network of black and white abolitionists who risked everything to dismantle slavery. One of the first to leave a lasting mark was William Still, the Philadelphia-based conductor of the Underground Railroad. He kept meticulous records of the freedom seekers who passed through his care, ensuring their stories would not be erased. Harriet learned from him the importance of documentation, of bearing witness to history, even if she herself could not read or write. She would later dictate her own stories to others, ensuring that future generations would know the truth. Then there was Thomas Garrett, a Quaker station master in Delaware, who helped hundreds escape slavery. His home was a safe haven, and his unwavering faith in God's justice mirrored Harriet's own deep spirituality. He taught her that faith was not passive, it was action. When she once arrived at his door with a group of fugitives, starving and frostbitten, he did not hesitate to give them shoes, food, and shelter. Even as bounty hunters prowled nearby, his kindness reinforced her belief that no one should be left behind. Frederick Douglass, though they did not meet often, was another towering figure in Harriet's life. He admired her fearlessness, once writing that he knew of no one who had willingly endured more hardship for the sake of others. Their shared experiences as former slaves who had seized their own freedom gave them a common language, a language of urgency and defiance. Douglass's eloquence as a writer and speaker showed Harriet the power of words, even as she continued to communicate through action. During the Civil War, new mentors emerged. General David Hunter, who commanded Union forces in the South, recognized Harriet's strategic brilliance and made her the first woman to lead an armed expedition, the Combahee River Raid, which liberated over 700 enslaved people. Colonel James Montgomery, another Union officer, worked closely with her, trusting her knowledge of the land and her ability to move unseen. These men, though part of a system that had long oppressed black people, respected her expertise in ways that few others did. And then there were the women, strong, determined souls, who expanded Harriet's understanding of freedom. Sojourner Truth, the legendary abolitionist and women's rights advocate, shared her belief that liberation was not just about breaking chains, but about claiming one's voice. The two women, both former slaves who had endured unimaginable suffering, understood each other without need for lengthy explanation. Truth's fearless speeches, delivered in a voice that carried like thunder, reminded Harriet that her own story was worth telling. Later in life, as she turned her attention to women's suffrage, she found kinship with Susan B. Anthony and other white suffragists. Though their backgrounds were vastly different, Harriet's presence in the movement forced them to confront the intersections of race and gender. She never let them forget that freedom for some was not freedom for all. When one suffragist suggested that the vote for black men should come before women's suffrage, Harriet gently but firmly reminded her that black women deserved both. But perhaps the most enduring of Harriet's relationships were with the people she led to freedom, the ones who called her Moses. They were not mentors in the traditional sense, but they shaped her just as deeply. Every trembling hand she held in the dark, every whispered prayer of gratitude, every child who clung to her as they crossed icy rivers. They reinforced her purpose. They taught her that leadership was not about glory, but about responsibility. As the years passed, some of these mentors faded from her life, while others remained until the end. What stayed constant was the way they wove themselves into her story, each thread strengthening the tapestry of her legacy. And so, as you let your thoughts drift toward sleep, imagine Harriet Tubman not as a solitary figure, but as someone surrounded by voices of guidance, of challenge, of love. They were the whispers in the night that kept her going, the hands that lifted her when she stumbled, the echoes of wisdom that turned a once enslaved girl into a legend. And just as they guided her, may their lessons now gently guide you into peaceful rest. Let your mind float with these gentle recollections as we move forward in our story. Harriet Tubman's early years were not marked by grand titles or formal professions, as one might imagine, but by quiet acts of defiance and determination that slowly, steadily built the foundation of her extraordinary life. Long before she became the Moses of her people, she was simply Minty, a young girl born into bondage on the eastern shore of Maryland, where the waters of the Chesapeake Bay whispered against the shores, and the rustling leaves of the forests held secrets of escape. Her first work was not chosen, but forced upon her, as was the cruel reality for enslaved children. By the age of 5 or 6, she was rented out to a neighboring plantation to care for a baby, rocked to sleep with the threat of punishment if the child awoke crying. The nights were long, the labor relentless, but even then, there was something unbreakable in her spirit. When she was no more than 12, she suffered a near-fatal injury, a blow to the head, from an iron weight meant for another enslaved worker. The wound left her with spells of dizziness and sudden, overwhelming sleepiness. But it also opened something else within her. Vivid dreams, visions she believed were sent from God, guiding her toward a destiny far greater than the one written for her by others. As a young woman, Harriet was sent to work in the fields, her hands calloused from the grueling labor of plowing and hauling timber. But even in those harsh conditions, she was learning, studying the land, memorizing the paths that wound through the marshes and forests, listening carefully to the hushed conversations of those who spoke of freedom. The Underground Railroad was not yet a part of her life, but the seeds were being planted. She learned from the older enslaved people, absorbing their wisdom, their quiet resistance. Some whispered of runaways who had vanished into the night, never to be seen again. Others spoke in code, singing spirituals with hidden meanings, songs that would one day guide her own journeys northward. Her first act of true defiance came in 1849, when she decided to flee. It was not a sudden decision, but one that had been simmering for years, fed by the stories of those who had gone before her. She left under the cover of night, following the North Star, trusting in the kindness of strangers who were part of the secret network of abolitionists. The journey was perilous, sleeping in swamps, wading through icy rivers, moving only when the moon was high and the overseers slept. But she made it, crossing into Pennsylvania, where she later recalled the feeling of the free earth beneath her feet. A sensation so overwhelming she could hardly believe it was real. Yet freedom for Harriet was never just about herself. Almost immediately, she began thinking of those she had left behind: her family, her friends, the countless others still trapped in bondage. And so, within a year of her own escape, she made her first trip back to Maryland as a conductor on the Underground Railroad. It was not a role she had sought, but one that found her, as naturally as breathing. She had no formal training, no maps, no weapons, just an unshakable faith and an intimate knowledge of the land. Her first successful rescue was her sister and 2 children, a mission fraught with danger. Slave catchers patrolled the roads. Advertisements offered rewards for runaways, and even the stars could be obscured by clouds, leaving her without her guiding light. But Harriet had learned to navigate by other means: the rustling of leaves, the distant call of owls, the way the wind carried voices from far away. She moved silently, speaking in hushed tones, instructing her charges to follow without question. If fear gripped them, she steadied them with quiet words, reminding them that turning back was far more dangerous than pressing forward. Over time, her reputation grew. Those who had once doubted her, both black and white abolitionists, soon realized that this small, unassuming woman was capable of the impossible. She never lost a passenger, a fact she credited to divine protection. Some said she had a 6th sense for danger, disappearing moments before patrols arrived, guiding her groups through swamps and thickets that seemed impassable. Others claimed she could charm the wary into trust, convincing strangers to hide fugitives in their barns or cellars. But Harriet herself knew the truth. She was simply doing what had to be done, one step at a time. The work was exhausting, both physically and emotionally. Each trip was a gamble with death, and the weight of responsibility was immense. Yet she returned again and again, rescuing not only her own family, but dozens of others, some who had never met her before, but had heard whispers of the woman who could lead them to freedom. She worked closely with abolitionists like Thomas Garrett, a Quaker station master in Delaware, and Frederick Douglass, who later wrote of her with deep admiration. But many of her most vital collaborators were unnamed: the free black communities who hid runaways, the sympathetic boat captains who ferried them across rivers, the farmers who left lanterns in windows to signal safe passage. By the 1850s, the Fugitive Slave Act had made her missions even more dangerous, forcing her to guide escapees all the way to Canada, where slavery could not reach them. The journeys grew longer, the risks greater, but Harriet did not waver. She adapted, learning new routes, forging new alliances. She also began speaking at abolitionist meetings, though she was never a polished orator like Douglass or Sojourner Truth. Her power was in her quiet certainty, her lived experience. When she spoke of slavery, she did not need embellishment. The scars on her body, the steel in her voice, told the story plainly. And so, as you let these images drift through your mind, the dark forests, the whispered prayers, the steady rhythm of footsteps moving toward freedom, remember that Harriet Tubman's early work was not marked by fanfare or recognition. It was built in the quiet hours, in the spaces between fear and courage, in the unshakable belief that no one should live in chains. Her first contributions were not recorded in ledgers or celebrated in newspapers, but they changed lives, one journey at a time. And as sleep draws near, may you feel the same quiet strength that carried her through those early nights, the certainty that even the longest journey begins with a single, determined step, drifting like clouds across the evening sky. We now move to the next part of this calming life story. Harriet Tubman's work did not stop with guiding enslaved people to freedom, though that alone would have been enough to etch her name in history. She carried the weight of each journey in her bones, the exhaustion settling deep, but she never allowed it to slow her steps. There was always another person waiting in the shadows, another family desperate for the chance to breathe free air. And so she continued, moving like a whisper through the night, her methods as precise as they were daring. She worked under the cloak of darkness, timing her escapes to the rhythms of the natural world. The moon's phases dictated her movements. New moons were best, when the sky was at its darkest and the overseers least watchful. She navigated by the stars, reading them like a map only she could decipher. The North Star was her constant guide, its steady light a promise that freedom lay ahead. She avoided roads when she could, sticking to dense forests and winding streams, where the rustling leaves and murmuring water covered the sound of footsteps. When she had to cross open fields, she moved at a crouch, her body low to the earth, her senses sharpened to every distant bark of a dog or snap of a twig. Her knowledge of the land was extraordinary. She memorized the safest paths, the hidden gullies, the abandoned barns where fugitives could rest for a few precious hours. She knew which farms belonged to abolitionists, which houses had secret rooms beneath their floors, which church basements could shelter a dozen people in silence. She carried a pistol not for violence, but as a warning to remind those she led that turning back was never an option. The journey was too perilous, the consequences of hesitation too dire. And then there were the songs. Harriet used music as code, humming spirituals that carried hidden messages to those who knew how to listen. A slow, mournful tune might signal danger ahead, while a brighter melody meant the path was clear. Go Down, Moses was one of her favorites, its lyrics speaking of deliverance, of a people led out of bondage. To the untrained ear, it was just another hymn. But and to those awaiting her signal, it was a call to move. By the time the Civil War broke out in 1861, Harriet had already freed dozens of people, some say as many as 70, though she never kept count. She measured success not in numbers, but in the faces of those who crossed into freedom, in the way their shoulders straightened when they realized the chains were truly gone. But the war opened a new chapter in her life, one where her skills would be used on an even larger scale. She traveled to South Carolina at the invitation of Union officers who had heard of her uncanny ability to move unseen through hostile territory. There, she served as a scout, spy, and nurse, working alongside the formerly enslaved people who had fled to Union camps. She knew the land, the waterways, the hidden trails that Confederate soldiers used to move supplies. She led raids, gathering intelligence from black communities still living under occupation, passing along crucial information that helped weaken the Confederate hold on the region. One of her most daring missions came in 1863, when she guided Colonel James Montgomery and his Black Union Regiment up the Combahee River. The plan was to destroy Confederate supply lines and liberate as many enslaved people as possible. Under cover of darkness, the steamboats slipped upriver, Harriet standing at the bow, her eyes scanning the banks for familiar landmarks. When they reached the plantations, the soldiers set fire to storehouses and cotton gins, the flames lighting up the night sky. But the true triumph came when hundreds of enslaved men, women, and children, some still clutching the tools they had been forced to work with, ran toward the boats, their voices rising in shouts of joy and disbelief. Harriet moved among them, steady as always, helping the elderly onto the decks, calming the children who trembled with fear and excitement. Over 700 people were freed that night, their lives forever changed because of her guidance. Later, when a reporter asked her to describe the scene, she simply said, "I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person now that I was free." After the war, Harriet settled in Auburn, New York, on land she had purchased years earlier. But even in peacetime, she did not rest. She took in those who had nowhere else to go, the elderly, the sick, the orphans of war. Her home became a refuge, just as she had once been a refuge for so many others. She fought for women's suffrage alongside Susan B. Anthony, believing that freedom was not complete until all people could claim their rights. And though she struggled financially, often selling produce from her garden to make ends meet, she never turned away anyone in need. In her final years, she established the Harriet Tubman Home for the Aged, ensuring that elderly Black Americans would have a place of dignity and care. It was a quiet end to a life that had been anything but quiet. A final act of service from a woman who had spent her entire life lifting others up. And so, as you let these stories settle in your mind, picture her not as a distant figure from history, but as a woman of flesh and spirit, her hands rough from labor, her voice soft but unshakable, her eyes always fixed on the horizon. She moved through the world with a quiet strength, one that did not need applause or monuments to affirm its worth. Her legacy is not just in the lives she saved, but in the belief she carried that freedom is worth every risk, every sacrifice, every step taken in the dark. And as sleep wraps around you now, may you feel the same stillness she knew in those rare moments of rest, the deep, unshakable peace of knowing that even in the darkest night, the morning will come as your breathing becomes more regular. Let us continue with the next chapter of our biography. The story of Harriet Tubman is woven with moments of quiet courage, decisions made in the still of night, paths chosen when the way forward was unclear. Each turning point in her life was like a stone dropped into water, sending ripples that would shape not only her own destiny, but the lives of countless others. As you settle deeper into rest, let these moments unfold gently, like the slow unspooling of a river carrying its travelers home. One of the first great crossroads in her life came when she was just a child. Born into slavery as Araminta Ross, she was hired out to work for other families, enduring hardship from a young age. One day, when she was about 12 years old, she stood in a store and watched as an overseer prepared to strike another enslaved person who had tried to flee. Without thinking, she stepped between them. The weight of the iron weight meant for another struck her skull instead, leaving her with seizures and vivid dreams for the rest of her life. In that moment, she chose defiance, though it came at a cost. Had she stayed silent, had she turned away, she might have lived a quieter life, spared the pain of her injury. But she did not. And that injury, as cruel as it was, also deepened her resolve. The visions she experienced afterward, which she believed were messages from God, would one day guide her as she led others to freedom. Years passed, and the longing for freedom grew within her. Then came another moment of decision, when she learned she was to be sold further south, a fate that often meant even harsher conditions. In 1849, she made her escape, slipping away under the cover of night, following the North Star. The journey was perilous. Every rustle in the underbrush could mean capture, every stranger's glance a threat. But she pressed on, guided by the kindness of free black communities and abolitionists who formed the hidden network of the Underground Railroad. Had she hesitated, had she waited for a safer time, she might never have left at all. But she went, step by step, until she crossed into Pennsylvania and tasted freedom for the first time. Yet even in that moment of triumph, another choice presented itself. She could have stayed in the North, lived quietly, built a life for herself beyond the reach of slavery. But the thought of her family, her brothers, her parents, so many others still in chains, would not let her rest. And so, just a year after her own escape, she turned back. She became a conductor on the Underground Railroad, risking everything to guide others to freedom. Over the next decade, she would return south again and again, leading more than 70 people to safety. Each journey was a gamble. Each decision to go back another roll of the dice against the bounty hunters who sought her capture. Had she chosen differently? Had she decided to protect herself? History might never have known her name, but she went, not for glory, not for fame, but because she believed freedom was a right, not a privilege. One of the most dangerous moments came in 1857, when she orchestrated the escape of her elderly parents. By then, her father was free, but her mother remained enslaved, and the law permitted her owner to claim him as well if they stayed in Maryland. Tubman, ever resourceful, arranged for a wagon to carry them north under the cover of darkness. The journey was slow, the risk immense. Her parents were not young, and the strain of travel could have been too much. But she knew they deserved to spend their final years in freedom. Had she left them behind, reasoning that the journey was too dangerous, they might have lived out their days under the shadow of slavery. Instead, she brought them to Auburn, New York, where they lived in peace, surrounded by family. The Civil War brought another turning point. When the conflict began, Tubman could have remained in the relative safety of the North, tending to her community. But she saw an opportunity, not just for herself, but for the thousands still enslaved in the South. She volunteered as a nurse, a scout, even a spy for the Union Army. Her knowledge of the land, her ability to move unseen, made her invaluable. In 1863, she became the first woman to lead an armed expedition in the war, guiding Union boats along the Combahee River in South Carolina. The raid liberated more than 700 enslaved people, a staggering number. Had she chosen to stay on the sidelines, those lives might have remained in bondage for years longer. But she stepped forward once again, because she understood that freedom was not something to be given. It was something to be taken, claimed, fought for. After the war, the country moved on, but Tubman did not. The struggle was not over. Though slavery had ended, poverty and injustice remained. She took in those who had nowhere else to go, turning her home into a refuge. And then, in her later years, came her final act of service, the Harriet Tubman Home for the Aged. It was a quiet mission, one that did not make headlines, but it was a testament to her lifelong belief that no one should be left behind. Had she retired quietly, no one would have blamed her. She had given more than most could ever imagine, but she chose to keep giving, to keep building, until the very end. And so, as you drift toward sleep, think of these moments not as distant history, but as choices, each one a thread in the tapestry of a life well lived. What if she had turned away when the overseer raised his hand? What if she had stayed in the North and never looked back? What if she had decided that enough was enough, that she had done her part? The world would be different, quieter perhaps, but lesser too. But Harriet Tubman did not choose the easy path. She chose the one that led others to freedom, to dignity, to hope. And as you close your eyes tonight, May you carry with you the same quiet certainty that guided her, the knowledge that even in the darkest night, the stars still shine, the river still flows, and the dawn will always come. The calming story continues as we gently examine what happened next in this remarkable journey. Harriet Tubman's life was woven with relationships, some tender, some tested by hardship, all shaping the woman who would become a beacon of hope. Let us drift back to the earliest of these bonds, the ones that anchored her before she ever dreamed of leading others to freedom. Her mother, Harriet Green, was a quiet force, a woman who had endured the unthinkable, yet still found ways to cradle her children in warmth. She passed down stories in whispers, songs that held secret meanings, and a resilience that would one day fuel her daughter's journeys. Tubman would later recall how her mother's hands, rough from labor, could still smooth her hair with gentleness, a reminder that love existed even in the harshest of worlds. Her father, Ben Ross, taught her to read the land, to listen for the whispers of the wind and the language of the stars. These lessons would become her compass, guiding her through dark forests and across treacherous rivers. Then there were the siblings, so many of them, each a thread in the fabric of her heart. She carried their names like prayers: Rachel, Mariah, Soph, Henry, Ben. The thought of them left behind in slavery haunted her, and it was this love that first pushed her to risk everything. When she escaped, she did not run just for herself, but for the promise of returning for them. And return she did, time and again, never resting until as many as she could reach were free. But love was not without its sorrows. Her first husband, John Tubman, chose not to follow her when she spoke of freedom. He could not see past the fear that gripped so many. What if they were caught? What if the cost was too high? When she left, she carried the weight of that goodbye, a reminder that not all hearts are ready to take the leap. Years later, when she returned for him, she learned he had remarried, content to stay where he was. It was a quiet heartbreak, but one that did not harden her. Instead, it deepened her understanding. Freedom was not just a place, but a state of mind, and not everyone was ready to claim it. Later, there was Nelson Davis, a man nearly 20 years her junior, who had fought in the Civil War. He was kind, steadfast, and shared her unshakable faith. They married in 1869, and though their time together was marked by poverty and struggle, it was also filled with quiet companionship. Nelson understood her work, her restlessness, her need to keep serving. When illness took him too soon, she grieved, but she did not stop. Even in loss, she found a way to keep moving forward. Among her dearest friendships was the bond she shared with Frederick Douglass. They admired each other from afar before ever meeting, two voices speaking the same truth in different ways. When they finally sat together, it was like the meeting of two rivers, strong, deep, and flowing toward the same destination. Douglass once wrote to her, "The difference between us is marked." She cherished those words, not for the praise, but for the recognition. They did not always agree. He believed in working within the system, while she had seen too much to trust it. But their respect never wavered. Then there was the circle of women who stood beside her. Women like Sojourner Truth and Susan B. Anthony. With them, she found kinship in the fight for more than freedom, for dignity, for votes, for the right to be seen. These friendships were not without tension. Some suffragists hesitated to tie their cause to that of black rights, fearing it would divide their movement. Tubman, who had lived the cost of division, refused to choose. She would not set one struggle aside for another. In time, even those who had doubted came to admire her steadfastness. And of course, there were those she led to freedom's strangers who became family on the perilous road north. She called them her passengers, but they were more than that. They were the reason she kept going when her body ached, when the bounty on her head grew higher, when the night seemed endless. Some she held as they wept from exhaustion. Others she scolded gently when fear made them falter. "Keep going," she would say, her voice firm but never unkind. One story tells of a man who wanted to turn back, terrified of the unknown. The woods were too dark, the journey too long. Tubman did not argue. It sounds harsh, but those who knew her understood it was not a threat, but a truth. To go back was to risk death or worse. And so he kept walking. Years later, that same man would find her and thank her, his voice thick with emotion. She would wave it off, as she always did, but the moment lingered. In her later years, her home in Auburn became a gathering place, a refuge for the tired, the sick, the ones with nowhere else to go. She took in orphans, fed the hungry, and sat with the elderly, telling stories by the fire. Some called her Aunt Harriet, a title warm with affection. She was stern when she needed to be, especially with young ones who didn't understand the cost of the freedom they now had. "Don't waste it," she would say, her eyes sharp, even in her final days, when her body was frail and her voice soft. People came to her, old friends, fellow abolitionists, young activists seeking wisdom. She would listen, nod, and sometimes offer a few words. "Stand up," she once told a visitor, "and so, as you drift toward sleep, think of these threads: the mother's hands, the husband who stayed behind, the friends who stood beside her, the strangers who became family, each one a part of her story, each one a reminder that no life is lived alone." Harriet Tubman's strength came not just from within, but from the love she gave and received, the bonds that held her even as she reached back to hold others. May you too feel the warmth of such connections as you close your eyes tonight. And may you dream of a world where no one is left behind, where the river of kindness runs deep, and where the stars, like Harriet's guiding light, always show the way home. Allow yourself to sink deeper into comfort as we explore the next phase of this soothing biography. Even in the quiet moments of her life, when the weight of her missions lifted for just a little while, Harriet Tubman found solace in the simple things. She was a woman of deep faith, and and her mornings often began with whispered prayers, her voice barely rising above the rustling of leaves outside her window. The light would filter in softly, painting the room in gold as she sat with her Bible, her fingers tracing the well-worn pages. She didn't just read the words, she felt them, letting them settle into her bones like a comforting embrace. Her home was a place of warmth, filled with the scent of wood smoke and freshly baked bread. She took pleasure in the rhythms of domestic life, kneading dough with strong, careful hands, or stirring a pot of stew over the fire. Cooking was more than necessity. It was an act of love. She would hum old spirituals as she worked, the melodies weaving through the air like threads of memory. Sometimes, if a neighbor or a friend stopped by, she would wrap a loaf in cloth and press it into their hands, her eyes crinkling with quiet joy. Harriet had a deep connection to the land, nurtured from her earliest days in Maryland. Even after her escape, she found peace in the soil, planting gardens wherever she settled. The earth, she believed, held a kind of wisdom, steady and patient. She would kneel among the rows of vegetables and flowers, her fingers brushing against tender shoots, whispering encouragement to the plants as if they were children. The garden was her sanctuary, a place where time slowed, and the only urgency was the gentle turning of the seasons. Her friendships were as rich as the soil she tended. She had a way of making people feel seen, whether it was a fugitive seeking shelter or a neighbor sharing a cup of tea. One of her closest companions was Frances Seward, the wife of abolitionist William Seward, whose family provided Harriet with a home in Auburn, New York. Their bond was one of mutual respect and quiet understanding. Frances would often sit with Harriet in the evenings, the two women talking softly by lamplight, their laughter mingling with the chirping of crickets outside. And then there was Nelson Davis, the man who would become her second husband. He was younger than her, a Civil War veteran who had known hardship and resilience. Their love was not the kind that burned brightly and faded. It was steady, like the glow of embers in a hearth. They shared a quiet life, tending their home together, finding joy in small moments. Nelson understood her in a way few others did, never asking her to soften her strength, only to let him stand beside her. Harriet had a fondness for children, though she never had any of her own. She treated the young ones in her community as if they were family, telling them stories by firelight or teaching them songs that carried the weight of history. Her voice, though weathered by years of struggle, still held a warmth that could soothe even the most restless child. She believed in them, in their futures, and she would often say that the world would change not by force alone, but by the hands of those who came after. In her later years, when her body ached and her steps grew slower, she would sit on her porch, wrapped in a shawl, watching the world move around her. The trees would sway, their leaves whispering secrets only she seemed to understand. She still found wonder in the flight of a bird or the first frost of winter, her heart attuned to the quiet beauty of the world. And though her name would be remembered for her bravery, for the countless lives she saved, it was these small moments, the bread shared, the garden tended, the hands held, that made her life whole. She was not just a heroine, but a woman who loved deeply, who found joy in the ordinary, and who believed, even in the darkest nights, that kindness was its own kind of light. So as you close your eyes tonight, imagine her there, sitting in the golden haze of a setting sun, her face lined with years, but her spirit unbroken. And may her quiet strength remind you that even the smallest acts of love can ripple outward, touching lives in ways we may never see. Sleep gently, knowing that the world is richer for having held her, and that her legacy is not just in the battle she fought, but in the peace she cultivated, one tender moment at a time, like a gentle river flowing toward the sea. Our story continues with the next meaningful chapter. Harriet Tubman's days unfolded with quiet purpose, shaped by the rhythms of necessity and the deep, steady beat of her unyielding spirit. In her earliest years on the Maryland plantation, mornings arrived with the gray light of dawn, long before the sun fully stretched across the sky. She would rise from the rough straw of her bed, the air still cool with the night's breath, and move silently to begin her tasks. Even as a child, her hands were never idle. There was wood to gather, water to fetch, and the endless labor of the fields, cotton, flax, and tobacco, pressing heavy upon her small frame. Yet even then, she learned to listen, to watch, to store away the knowledge of the land, the patterns of the overseers, the songs the elders hummed beneath their breath. These were the quiet lessons that would one day guide others to freedom. As she grew, her work shifted. She was sent to the timber fields, her muscles hardening under the weight of logs and the bite of the axe. The forest became her companion, its rustling leaves and whispering winds, a language she understood. She learned to read the stars, not as a sailor might, but as a traveler who would one day need their light to navigate the unseen paths northward. In the evenings, after the overseer's whip had stilled and the others had retreated to their quarters, she would sit by the fire, her fingers working at mending clothes or twisting corn husks into makeshift dolls for the children. The firelight flickered in her dark eyes, and if anyone had looked closely, they might have seen the quiet determination burning there, a flame that would not be extinguished. When she finally made her escape, her days took on a new rhythm, one of secrecy and survival. She moved by night, her feet bare against the cold earth, her body bent low beneath the cover of trees and underbrush. The North Star was her guide, its steady glow a promise. She slept in fits and starts, curled in root cellars or beneath the sheltering arms of pine trees, her ears tuned to every snap of a twig, every distant bark of a dog. Hunger was a constant companion, but she knew which berries were safe, which roots could be chewed for sustenance. The land, once a place of bondage, now gave her passage, and she thanked it with each careful step in the years that followed, as she returned again and again to lead others to freedom. Her routines became a careful dance of caution and courage. She traveled in the fall and winter, when the nights were long and the fields lay fallow, leaving fewer eyes to witness her passage. She carried a pistol, not for violence, but as a reminder to herself and those she guided that turning back was not an option. Her voice was low and steady as she instructed her charges. Step where I step, move when I move. She knew the safest houses, the kindest strangers, the places where a loaf of bread or a warm blanket might be waiting. And when dawn threatened to expose them, she would guide her group into the hidden corners of barns or the hushed safety of attics, where they would sleep like shadows until night fell once more. Later, when the war came, and she worked as a scout and a spy, her days were filled with motion, riding through the marshes, slipping behind enemy lines, her mind sharp as she memorized troop movements and river crossings. She cooked for the soldiers, stirring pots of beans and boiling coffee over open fires, her hands as capable with a ladle as they were with a rifle. At night, she sometimes sang, her voice a deep, comforting hum that eased the fears of the men around her. They called her Moses, but she was simply Harriet, a woman who had learned long ago that freedom was not just a destination, but a daily act of courage. In her later years, when her body had grown weary and her steps slow, she rose with the sun in the small home she had built in Auburn. The ache in her bones was a reminder of all she had endured, but she did not complain. She would wrap herself in a shawl, the wool soft against her skin, and step out onto the porch to watch the morning unfold. The birds greeted her with their songs, and she smiled, knowing each note by heart. Breakfast was simple cornbread warmed on the stove, a cup of tea sweetened with honey from her own hives. She moved through her garden with care, her fingers brushing the leaves of the plants she tended, the tomatoes and beans and collard greens that would feed her, and those she welcomed at her table. Afternoons were for rest, for sitting in the shade of the old oak tree with a quilt draped over her lap. Neighbors would come, children would gather, and she would tell them stories, not of war or danger, but of the kindness of strangers, of the power of faith, of the quiet moments that had carried her through. Her voice was a balm, steady and warm, and they listened as if she were spinning gold from the air. Evenings were gentle. She would light a lamp, its glow soft against the walls, and perhaps write a letter or mend a dress. Supper was shared, always with room for one more at the table. And when the night grew deep, she would kneel beside her bed, her hands clasped, her prayers whispered like secrets to the sky. Then she would sleep, her breath even, her dreams untroubled, a woman who had walked through fire and emerged not hardened, but softened, her heart still open, still believing in the goodness of the world. And so, as you drift toward sleep tonight, imagine her there, her hands folded, her face serene, The stars outside her window, the same ones that once guided her home. Let her peace be yours, her strength a quiet echo in your own heart. Rest well, knowing that even in stillness, her spirit moves, a gentle tide of courage and love that will never fade. As your thoughts grow quieter, we'll continue our peaceful exploration of this fascinating life. Harriet Tubman carried her faith like a lantern in the dark, its glow steady even in the deepest nights. She believed, without hesitation, that God spoke to her, not in grand proclamations, but in quiet whispers, in dreams that felt more like memories, in the sudden knowing that told her when to move, when to hide, when to lead others forward. That faith was not passive. It was a force that propelled her, step by step, through forests and across rivers, back into the jaws of danger again and again. And he did. Her philosophy was simple, though forged in hardship. Freedom was a divine right, and no person was meant to live in chains. But what set her apart was not just her conviction. It was her refusal to let bitterness take root. She had known cruelty, had felt the lash, had seen families torn apart, yet she never believed the world was beyond redemption. Even in the darkest moments, she trusted in the kindness of strangers, the Quaker farmers who hid her, the free black communities who fed her, the conductors of the Underground Railroad who risked everything for people they might never meet. These acts of courage, large and small, became the foundation of her belief that goodness existed, even if it had to be sought like hidden water in a drought. She understood fear, but she did not let it rule her. Once, during a rescue mission, she found herself face to face with a former enslaver, a man who would have recognized her instantly. She could have frozen, could have turned back, but instead, she bent down and pretended to read a newspaper, her hands steady even as her heart raced. The moment passed, and she moved on, her calm a shield against danger. Later, she would say, "I had reasoned this out in my mind. There was one of two things I had a right to, liberty or death. It was not recklessness, but a quiet, unshakable resolve." Her worldview was shaped by the land as much as by her spirit. The woods were not just a hiding place. They were alive with signs and messages, the call of an owl, the rustle of leaves, the position of the North Star. All of it spoke to her, guiding her like an unseen hand. She learned to move without sound, to sense danger before it arrived, to trust the earth as her ally. This deep connection to nature was not just survival. It was a kind of communion, a reminder that the world was vast and full of mysteries beyond human control. She never took that for granted. Her compassion was boundless, but it was not naive. She knew the cost of freedom, had seen it in the faces of those she led to safety, the exhaustion, the hunger, the terror that lingered even after the chains were gone. Yet she never turned anyone away, not even when the risks grew unbearable. It was a point of pride, yes, but also a testament to her belief that every life was worth the struggle. As she grew older, her mission expanded beyond escape. She fought for women's suffrage, for the rights of the elderly, for education for Black children. She believed freedom was not just about the body, but the mind and soul. To her, the greatest bondage was the belief that change was impossible. Her final years were spent in a modest home in Auburn, New York, where she took in the sick, the poor, the ones society had forgotten. Even then, her hands were never still knitting, cooking, tending her garden. Visitors would come, drawn by her legend, and find not a fierce warrior, but a small woman with a gentle voice and eyes that still sparkled with mischief. She would tell stories, but not of her own heroism. Instead, she spoke of the people who had helped her along the way, the moments of luck and grace, the faith that had carried her. And when the night came, she would kneel by her bed, just as she had done all those years before in the slave quarters, in the safe houses, in the woods. Her prayers were the same gratitude for the journey, for the lives she had touched, for the God who had never left her side. Then she would sleep, her breath slow, and even her dreams untroubled. As you close your eyes tonight, imagine her there, not as a figure from history books, but as a woman who knew the weight of the world and still chose kindness, who faced the worst of humanity and still believed in its goodness. Let her faith be a whisper in your ear, her courage a steady rhythm in your chest. And as you drift into sleep, remember her words, soft but unshakable. Every great dream begins with a dreamer. Rest now, and may her quiet strength be yours. With each breath becoming slower and deeper, let us turn to another aspect of this soothing story. Harriet Tubman's life was not one of ease, but of relentless struggle, each challenge shaping her into the unyielding force she became. From her earliest days, hardship was her constant companion. Born into slavery, she knew the sting of the whip before she knew the warmth of comfort. As a child, she labored under the weight of tasks too heavy for her small frame, her hands rough from work, her feet bare against the unforgiving earth. Yet even then, there was a fire within her, a quiet, stubborn refusal to accept the world as it was. One of her first great trials came when she was just a girl. A runaway slave had been discovered, and the overseer demanded that Harriet help restrain him. She refused. In that moment, she chose defiance. Though she knew the cost would be high, the overseer, enraged, picked up a heavy iron weight and hurled it at her head. The blow nearly killed her. For days, she drifted in and out of consciousness, her skull cracked, her body broken. The pain never fully left her. She would suffer sudden, blinding headaches for the rest of her life. But even this did not break her spirit. Instead, it deepened her understanding of cruelty and strengthened her resolve to fight against it. When she finally escaped slavery, the journey itself was a gauntlet of terror. The woods were alive with danger, patrollers with dogs, bounty hunters hungry for reward money, the ever-present fear of betrayal. She traveled by night, guided only by the North Star, her feet numb from the cold, her stomach hollow with hunger. More than once, she thought of turning back. The weight of exhaustion pressed down on her, whispering that surrender would be easier, but she pushed forward, step by aching step, until at last she crossed into freedom. Yet even then, her trials were far from over. Freedom was not a destination, but a beginning. She could have stayed in the North, lived a quiet life, but she chose instead to return again and again to the land of her enslavement, risking everything to lead others to safety. Each journey was a dance with death. The Underground Railroad was not a clear path, but a shifting, treacherous web of safe houses and secret signals, where trust was rare and danger lurked in every shadow. She carried a pistol not for violence, but as a last resort, a promise to herself that she would never let the chains take her or those she guided alive. There were close calls, moments when the darkness seemed to swallow her whole. Once, hiding in a swamp with a group of fugitives, she heard the baying of hounds drawing closer. The water was icy, the reeds sharp against her skin. She pressed her hand to a baby's mouth to stifle its cries, her own breath held tight in her chest. The dogs passed so near she could smell their wet fur, hear the snarls of the men leading them, but the swamp kept its secrets, and when the danger had moved on, she led her group forward once more, her voice steady, her hands sure. Even in freedom, hardship followed her. The Civil War brought new battles. She worked as a nurse, a scout, a spy roles that demanded everything from her. In the heat of battle, she tended to the wounded, her hands stained with blood, her heart heavy with the cries of the dying. She led raids, slipping behind enemy lines to gather intelligence, her knowledge of the land as sharp as any map. But for all her service, she was paid little and often treated as less than those around her. The country she fought for still struggled to see her as anything but a former slave. And when the war ended, the struggle did not. She fought for her rightful pay, for recognition, for the rights of her people in a world that still sought to deny them. She took in the elderly, the sick, those with nowhere else to go, even when she had little to give. Her home was always open, her table always shared, though her own pockets were often empty. Through it all, she never lost faith, not in God, not in the goodness of people, not in the belief that freedom was worth every sacrifice. She learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the will to move forward despite it. That strength was not in never falling, but in rising each time she did. And that love for her people, for justice, for the dream of a better world, was the truest compass, guiding her even in the darkest nights. So as you rest tonight, let her struggles remind you that no burden is too heavy when carried with purpose. Let her quiet perseverance soothe your own worries, like a lullaby of resilience. And as sleep draws near, imagine her voice, soft but sure, whispering that even the longest night must give way to dawn. breathe deeply and let her story carry you into dreams. The tapestry of this remarkable life unfolds further as we gently explore the next meaningful period. Harriet Tubman was a woman of many layers, a soul as deep as the rivers she crossed under cover of night, while history remembers her as the fearless conductor of the Underground Railroad. There were quiet corners of her life, soft and unassuming, that reveal the full tapestry of her humanity. Few know that Harriet had a way with plants, that her hands, so often clenched in determination, could also cradle a seedling with surprising tenderness. She understood the earth, when to plant, when to harvest, how to coax life from stubborn soil. In her later years, when she settled in Auburn, New York, she would rise before dawn just to walk among her garden, running her fingers over the leaves of herbs she used for healing: mint for stomach aches, yarrow for wounds, chamomile for troubled sleep. She learned these remedies not from books, but from whispered knowledge passed down through generations of women before her. There was something sacred in the way she moved among the greenery, as if the plants whispered back to her. She was also a storyteller, though not in the way one might expect. Around the fire on cold evenings, she would sometimes weave tales not of her own escapes, but of Anansi, the spider, Biarur rabbit, and other figures from African folklore. Her voice would dip and rise like a gentle stream, lulling children into wide-eyed wonder. These were stories of cunning, of small creatures outsmarting larger foes, lessons disguised as entertainment. Even in laughter, she was teaching. And then there was her singing. Harriet didn't just hum hymns to signal freedom. She had a voice that could soothe as easily as it could command. In the quiet of her home, when the weight of the world pressed too heavily, she would sing old spirituals, slow and low, letting the melody carry her burdens away. Sometimes, neighbors would pause outside her door just to listen, as if the very air around her hummed with peace. She had a quiet sense of humor, too, a spark of mischief that those closest to her cherished. Once, when a young visitor asked if she was ever afraid during her rescues, she simply smiled and said, "Child, fear and I got well acquainted long ago." She could disarm tension with a single dry remark, a reminder that even the bravest souls find light in the darkest places. Harriet was also deeply superstitious in ways that might surprise modern listeners. She carried charms, a rabbit's foot, a smooth stone given to her by those who believed in signs and protection. She never dismissed these small tokens, for she had learned that faith took many forms. Dreams, too, held weight for her. She often spoke of visions that guided her, not unlike the biblical prophets she admired. Whether divine or instinctual, she trusted these whispers from the unseen world. In her private moments, she was a woman who cherished small comforts: the warmth of a quilt stitched by her own hands, the taste of honey stirred into tea, the sound of rain on a tin roof. She found joy in the ordinary, a counterbalance to the extraordinary risks of her life, even in her old age, when her body ached from years of hardship. She would sit by the window and watch the birds, marveling at their freedom. And yet, for all her tenderness, she could be stern when needed. She had little patience for cowardice or betrayal, and her sharp tongue could silence a room if she felt someone was acting unjustly. She believed in discipline, not cruelty, but the kind of firmness that comes from knowing what is at stake. Still, her anger never lasted long. Like a summer storm, it would pass, leaving behind a clearer sky. Perhaps most surprising was her love of finery. Though she lived simply, she had a fondness for beautiful shawls and well-made shoes. Small indulgences she allowed herself after decades of deprivation. She once walked miles to buy a particular shade of blue ribbon, not because she needed it, but because it reminded her of the sky just before dawn, a color worth carrying with her. These small details, these quiet contradictions, make her all the more real. She was not just a hero carved in stone, but a woman who knew the weight of sorrow and the sweetness of rest, a woman who could nurse a wounded bird back to flight as surely as she could lead a man to freedom. A woman who, despite everything, still found reasons to laugh. So as you drift toward sleep tonight, imagine her not only as the legend, but as the whole person gardening under the sun, humming as she stirs a pot of soup, patting the pocket where she keeps a lucky stone. Let the fullness of her life wrap around you like a well-worn quilt, warm and comforting. And just as she trusted the North Star to guide her, trust now in the quiet rhythm of your breath, carrying you gently into dreams. As you settle more comfortably, our narrative flows onward like soft moonlight across still waters. To understand the world Harriet Tubman walked through, we must first step back into the early 1800s, a time when the world was shifting in slow, seismic ways. The air smelled of wood smoke and turned earth, of ink drying on parchment, as nations struggled to define themselves. Across the Atlantic, the Industrial Revolution hummed like a gathering storm, its machines spinning cotton that would soon tighten the grip of slavery in the American South. But in the quiet corners of Maryland, where Harriet was born around 1822, life moved to older rhythms: the creak of wagon wheels, the whisper of cornstalks in the wind, the muffled songs of people whose bodies were owned, but whose spirits never could be. It was an era of contradictions. The United States, barely 50 years old, preached liberty while permitting bondage. The Declaration of Independence's lofty words about all men being created equal rang hollow for the millions enslaved. Yet even in the darkness, small lights flickered. The abolitionist movement was growing, its voices rising in newspapers, church halls, and parlors, where people dared to imagine a different world. Figures like Frederick Douglass, who escaped slavery himself, wrote and spoke with such fire that minds began to change. Across the ocean, Britain abolished slavery in its empire in 1833, a ripple of hope that reached American shores. Harriet came of age in this turbulent time, her childhood marked by hardship, rented out to other farms, separated from family, bearing scars from punishments meant to break her. But the same years that tried to crush her also forged her. She learned to read the land like a map, to move silently through forests where owl calls and rustling leaves spoke more clearly than words. The Underground Railroad, that secret network of safe houses and courageous allies, was already weaving its threads through the countryside by the time she escaped in 1849, and when she returned again and again to guide others to freedom. She did so in a world where the stakes grew ever higher. The 1850s brought the Fugitive Slave Act, a law so cruel it required even free states to return escaped slaves to their enslavers. Overnight, the North became more dangerous, and Harriet's missions grew riskier. Yet, this was also the decade when she became a legend, earning the nickname Moses for leading her people out of bondage. The railroads and telegraphs that connected the country also helped abolitionists organize, spreading news and warnings with unprecedented speed. Harriet herself used these changes, taking night trains when she could, trusting station agents who slipped her information between the lines of casual conversation. Beyond America's borders, the world kept turning. The Crimean War raged in Europe, while in India, the British Empire tightened its hold. Closer to home, the gold rush drew dreamers westward, their wagons carving trails that would one day carry refugees from slavery too. Harriet's own journeys unfolded against this backdrop of movement and upheaval, of old certainties crumbling and new ones not yet born. When the Civil War came in 1861, Harriet did not hesitate. She served as a nurse, a scout, even a spy for the Union Army, her knowledge of the land and its people proving invaluable. The war itself was a cataclysm that reshaped the nation, its battles fought with rifles and ideals. The Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 declared enslaved people in Confederate states free, though true freedom would take much longer to secure. Harriet, ever practical, kept working, cooking for soldiers, tending the wounded, even leading a raid that liberated hundreds. After the war, she settled in Auburn, New York, but her fight wasn't over. The late 1800s saw reconstructions, promises broken, the rise of Jim Crow, and new forms of oppression replacing the old. Yet Harriet, now in her later years, turned her energy to suffrage, standing alongside Susan B. Anthony to demand votes for women. The world around her was inventing itself anew. Thomas Edison's light bulbs glowed in city streets. Telephone wires crisscrossed the skies, and the first skyscrapers reached upward. But Harriet's focus remained on the earthbound struggles of her people, on growing food in her garden, on raising funds for a home for the aged, where she would one day live out her days. And through it all, she carried those small beauties, the blue ribbon, the well-made shoes, reminders that joy was not frivolous, but necessary. Her life spanned an age of revolutions, yet she never lost sight of the personal, the quiet moments that made the struggle worthwhile, the clatter of spoons in her kitchen, the smell of apples drying in the sun, the weight of a child's hand in hers. These were the textures of a life lived fully, amidst the tides of history. So as you drift now, imagine not just the grand arcs of history, but the softness woven between them, the way candlelight flickered on Harriet's face as she mended a dress, the sound of rain on the roof the night she planned another rescue, the warmth of a cup of tea after miles walked in cold darkness. The past is not just dates and battles, but breath and heartbeat, the small stitches that hold the tapestry together. Let these thoughts cradle you as you sink deeper, carried like a leaf on the slow river of time, until sleep takes you gently into its arms. Let the rhythm of these words carry you further into relaxation as we continue our peaceful journey. Harriet Tubman's life was like a stone cast into still waters. The ripples of her actions spread far beyond the moments she lived, touching generations yet to come, even as she tended her garden in Auburn, even as she sat in quiet conversation with neighbors or spoke at suffrage meetings. Her presence carried the weight of something extraordinary. People who knew her spoke of her in hushed tones, as if her very name held a kind of power. And in many ways, it did. Her work as a conductor on the Underground Railroad was not just about moving people from one place to another. It was about rewriting what freedom could mean in a country that had tried so hard to deny it. Each time she led someone north, she was proving, step by step, that the impossible could be made possible. The stories of her journeys spread through whispered conversations, through letters passed hand to hand, through the songs sung in churches where coded lyrics spoke of deliverance. The spiritual go down, Moses, became forever linked to her, a melody that carried both sorrow and defiance. And in those songs, in those stories, she became something more than a woman. She became a symbol, a beacon. But symbols can sometimes overshadow the real person behind them. Harriet was not a myth. She was flesh and blood, a woman who laughed, who wept, who grew tired, who kept going anyway. And it was in that very humanness that her greatest impact lay. She showed that courage was not the absence of fear, but the will to act despite it. She taught that resistance could be quiet as well as loud, a whispered word, a hidden path, a meal shared with a fugitive under cover of night. In the years after the Civil War, as the promises of Reconstruction crumbled and the shadows of Jim Crow lengthened, Harriet's legacy took on new layers for Black communities struggling under fresh oppression. Her life was a reminder that survival was itself a form of rebellion. Parents told their children about the woman who had walked through darkness to bring others to light, not just to inspire them, but to remind them that they, too, carried that same strength. And for white allies, those who had worked alongside her in abolitionist circles, who had heard her speak with such quiet fire. Her presence had shifted something in them. She had forced them to see the humanity of those they fought for, not as abstract figures, but as individuals with names, with families, with dreams. Her later work with the suffrage movement wove another thread into the tapestry of her influence, standing beside figures like Susan B. Anthony. She insisted that the fight for women's rights could not ignore the struggles of Black women. It was a lesson that many in the movement would forget, only to relearn generations later. But Harriet's voice, though often overlooked in the grand narratives of suffrage, lingered in the memories of those who had heard it. She had been a living bridge between movements, between causes, showing that justice was not a single road, but many paths intersecting. And then there were the quieter ways she shaped the world around her. The home for the aged she worked so hard to establish in Auburn was more than bricks and mortar. It was a statement, a declaration that those who had spent their lives in struggle deserved dignity in their final years. Her garden, where she grew food not just for herself, but for others, was another kind of teaching. It spoke of self-reliance, of care, of the simple truth that even in a world full of grand injustices, the act of nurturing something could be its own kind of resistance. As the 20th century dawned, Harriet's physical presence faded, but her imprint on culture only deepened. Schools and community centers began to bear her name. Artists painted her likeness. Poets wove her into verses. Playwrights brought her story to the stage. Yet, for a long time, the mainstream histories still struggled to place her properly. She was often reduced to a footnote, a brave but solitary figure, when in truth she had been part of a vast and interconnected web of people fighting for freedom. It took time for the fuller picture to emerge. Scholars began to piece together not just what she had done, but how she had done it, the networks she relied on, the strategies she employed, the way she had turned her own trauma into a force for good. Historians traced the lives of those she had rescued, finding families who had flourished because of her, generations who owed their existence to her courage. And slowly, the public understanding of her shifted, no longer just a heroic anecdote. She became a lens through which to examine the complexities of race, gender, and resistance in America. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, Harriet Tubman had ascended beyond history books into the realm of cultural icon. Her face was proposed for the $20 bill, a symbolic correction to a currency that had long celebrated figures who upheld systems she had fought against. Children's books told her story in bright colors and simple words, ensuring that even the youngest could learn her name. Museums curated exhibits around her, not as a relic of the past, but as a living touchstone for conversations about justice that were still unfolding. And yet, for all the grand recognitions, the truest measure of her impact may be in the small, everyday ways she continues to appear in people's lives. The student who hears her story and feels less alone in their own struggles. The activist who recalls her perseverance on a long night of organizing. The parent who tucks their child in with tales of the woman who never turned back. Harriet's life reminds us that change is built not only in sweeping gestures, but in the accumulation of steadfast steps, in the refusal to let go of hope, even when the night seems endless. So as you drift toward sleep, let your thoughts rest on this, that a woman who began her life in chains became, through sheer force of will and heart, a guiding star for millions, not because she was perfect, not because she was fearless, but because she kept going. And in that keeping going, she left behind a light that still shines softly, persistently through the darkness of history, inviting us all to follow. With the gentleness of falling snow, we transition now to another meaningful chapter in this life story. Let us drift back now, gently, to the quiet moments and lesser-known stories of Harriet Tubman's life, small, revealing glimpses that show not just the legend, but the woman behind it. Picture her as a child, small and observant, her given name Araminta, though she would later choose the name Harriet for herself. She was known as Minty to her family, a tender nickname for a girl who would one day carry the weight of so many lives on her shoulders. Even then, she had a quiet strength, though the world around her was cruel and unyielding. One of her earliest memories was of being hired out to a woman who beat her for minor mistakes, like letting a baby cry too long. The scars from those whippings stayed with her all her life, a physical reminder of the brutality she endured and survived. There is a story from her childhood, often overlooked, that speaks to her deep connection with nature. She learned early to read the land, to listen to the whispers of the wind and the rustling of leaves. She would later say that the woods taught her how to move silently, how to hide, how to sense danger before it arrived. This knowledge would become vital when she guided others to freedom. But it began in those quiet hours as a child, watching, waiting, learning the language of the earth. One of the most defining moments of her life came when she was just a teenager. She was standing in a dry goods store when an overseer, angry at a young enslaved man who had tried to run, threw a heavy metal weight at him. It missed its target and struck Harriet square in the head. The injury nearly killed her, and for days she drifted in and out of consciousness. When she finally woke, she was changed. She began having vivid dreams and visions, which she believed were messages from God. Some dismissed these episodes as mere hallucinations, but to Harriet, they were divine guidance. They gave her a sense of purpose, a certainty that she was meant for something greater. Years later, when she made her own escape from slavery, she carried those visions with her. The journey was perilous, but she moved with the quiet confidence of someone who believed she was protected. She followed the North Star, waded through swamps, and trusted the kindness of strangers in the underground railroad network. When she finally crossed into Pennsylvania, she described the moment as transcendent. The first time in her life, she knew what it was to be free, but even then, her thoughts turned back to those she had left behind. Freedom, she realized, was not something she could keep for herself alone. And so she returned, again and again, at unimaginable risk. One of the most remarkable but rarely discussed details of her rescues was her use of songs. She had a deep, rich voice, and she would sing spirituals as signals to those she was guiding. Certain phrases meant it was time to move, others meant danger was near. The songs were a code, but they were also a comfort, a way to steady the hearts of those trembling in the dark. On one journey, she carried a baby whose cries threatened to give them away. Without hesitation, she gave the child a drop of paregoric, a medicine to quiet it, and pressed on through the night. It was a small act, a desperate one, but it spoke to the impossible choices she faced and the lengths she would go to see her people free. There were moments, too, of unexpected tenderness. On one of her trips back to Maryland, she located her aging parents and brought them north to safety. Her father, Ben, was skeptical at first. Freedom seemed too distant a hope for someone his age, but Harriet, ever determined, arranged for a wagon to carry them, disguising them as a frail old couple being taken to visit relatives. When they finally reached the free state of Pennsylvania, her father wept, unable to believe he had lived long enough to see liberty. Harriet's courage was not limited to the Underground Railroad. During the Civil War, she worked as a scout, spy, and nurse for the Union Army. She became the first woman to lead an armed expedition, guiding a raid that freed over 700 enslaved people along the Combahee River. The soldiers who served with her spoke of her uncanny ability to move undetected through enemy territory, her instincts sharper than any map. But what they remembered most was her calm, the way she could steady a room with just her presence. Even in the chaos of war, she was a quiet force, unwavering. In her later years, when she settled in Auburn, New York, she opened her home to those in need: orphans, the elderly, anyone without a place to go. She had little money herself, but she shared what she had. Neighbors would later recall how she could be seen in her garden, humming as she worked the soil, as if the earth still spoke to her as it had when she was a child. She never stopped believing in the power of community, in the idea that no one should be left behind. And so, as sleep begins to settle over you, let these small stories linger in your mind, the songs in the dark, the visions she trusted, the quiet way she tended to the land and the people around her. Harriet Tubman was not just a hero of grand gestures, but of countless small, determined acts. She moved through the world with a steadiness that defied fear, a faith that refused to be broken, and in that, she left behind not just a legacy, but an invitation to keep going, to hold on, to believe that even the longest night will eventually give way to dawn. As your eyelids grow heavier we'll softly explore another dimension of this fascinating biography. In the quiet years that followed the war, Harriet Tubman settled into a rhythm of life that was softer, though no less purposeful. Auburn, New York, became her home, a place where the trees whispered in the wind, and the seasons turned with a gentle predictability. She had bought a small parcel of land there years before, with money earned from selling produce and baked goods, and now it became a refuge not just for her, but for others who had nowhere else to go. Her house was never empty. There were always voices drifting through the rooms, children laughing, elders sharing stories, neighbors stopping by with news or a basket of eggs. It was as if the Underground Railroad had never truly ended for her. She was still guiding people to safety, still offering shelter, still making sure no one was left behind. Her days began early, often before the sun had fully risen. She would step outside, the cool morning air brushing against her skin, and walk through her garden with the same careful attention she had once given to the hidden paths of the Underground Railroad. The earth responded to her touch. Tomatoes grew plump and red, beans climbed their trellises with vigor, and the herbs she planted filled the air with their quiet fragrance. She worked slowly, methodically, as if each plant was a life she was tending. Sometimes she hummed as she worked, old spirituals that had carried her through darker times. The songs had not lost their power. They still held the weight of memory, of faith, of a promise that had carried her through so many dangers. Though the war was over, Harriet's work was not. She knew freedom on paper was not the same as freedom in practice. And so she continued to fight, just in quieter ways. She took in those who had been abandoned, elderly black men and women with no family to care for them, children who had lost their parents to illness or violence. Her home became known as a place of kindness, a place where the weary could rest. She had little money. The government had never paid her properly for her wartime service, but she shared what she had: a bowl of soup, a warm blanket, a listening ear. These were small things, perhaps, but they were everything to those who received them. In time, she turned her attention to a new project, a home for the aged. She had seen too many elders cast aside, their years of labor forgotten. So she began raising funds, speaking at churches and community gatherings, telling stories of her own journeys and the people who had helped her along the way. It was slow work. Money was scarce, and progress came in fits and starts. But Harriet was patient. She had learned long ago that change did not always come quickly, but it did come if you kept moving forward. Her reputation as a living legend grew, though she never sought the spotlight. Visitors came to Auburn just to meet her, to hear her speak, to shake her hand. Some were abolitionists who had fought alongside her in the struggle for freedom. Others were younger, black men and women who saw in her a model of what was possible. She welcomed them all with the same quiet grace, though she often deflected praise. "I was just doing what I had to do, she would say. Even in her later years, her mind remained sharp, her spirit unbroken. She loved to sit on her porch in the evenings, watching the fireflies flicker over the fields. Sometimes she would tell stories, not just of the Underground Railroad, but of her childhood, of the way the stars had looked over the Maryland marshes, of the dreams that had guided her. She spoke of her parents, of the husband she had lost, of the friends who had risked everything to help her. Her voice was steady, unhurried, as if she had all the time in the world. And yet, time was not endless. The years had taken their toll, the headaches that had plagued her since childhood grew more frequent. The old injury from when the overseer had struck her with a weight, the one that had sent her into visions ever since, ached in the cold. But she did not complain. Pain was an old companion, and she had long since learned how to carry it. In 1913, as winter gave way to spring, Harriet grew weaker. She had lived nearly a century, though no one knew her exact age. Enslavement had stolen even that from her. Friends and family gathered at her bedside, their voices soft, their presence a comfort. She was not afraid. She had faced death many times before, in the swamps and forests, in the hushed darkness of safe houses. She had always trusted that she would know when her work was done. On March 10, she closed her eyes for the last time. The room was quiet, the only sound the rustling of the wind outside. She had asked to be buried with military honors, a recognition of her service during the war. And so they came, soldiers in uniform, old comrades, neighbors who had known her kindness. The procession moved slowly through Auburn, past the homes she had visited, the church where she had worshipped, the land she had tended. Her legacy did not end with her passing. The stories of her courage spread, carried by those who had known her, and those who had only heard whispers of her deeds. Schools and community centers were named in her honor. Her face would one day grace the $20 bill, a tribute to a woman who had given so much and asked for so little in return. But perhaps her greatest legacy was the way she lived, not as a distant hero, but as a woman who had tended her garden, fed her neighbors, and never stopped believing in the possibility of a better world. And so, as you drift toward sleep, let her story settle over you like a quiet blanket. Think of the way she moved through the world, not with grand speeches or fanfare, but with steady hands and an unshakable heart. Think of the garden she planted, the songs she hummed, the way she made room at her table for anyone in need. Harriet Tubman's life was a testament to the power of small, persistent acts of courage. She showed us that even in the darkest night, a single light can guide the way, and that if we keep moving forward, dawn will always come. Rest now, knowing that her story is not just a memory, but an invitation to be kind, to be brave, to trust that every step, no matter how small, carries us closer to the light. The gentle cadence of our story continues, flowing like a peaceful stream through the next chapter. Harriet Tubman's legacy stretches far beyond the years she walked the earth, like the roots of an ancient tree reaching deep into the soil, nourishing everything that grows in its shade. Long after her voice fell silent, her spirit continued to whisper through the lives of those who heard her story, who carried her courage in their hearts, and who saw in her example a blueprint for their own acts of bravery. Her life was not just a moment in history, but a steady current flowing through time, shaping the world in ways both seen and unseen. In the quiet corners of classrooms where children learn her name, in the determined steps of activists who march for justice, in the quiet resolve of everyday people who choose kindness over indifference, her presence lingers. Schools bear her name, not just as buildings of brick and mortar, but as places where young minds are taught that one person's conviction can change the course of history. Community centers founded in her honor serve as gathering places where people find strength in solidarity, just as she once brought strangers together under the cover of night, leading them toward freedom. The decision to place her face on the $20 bill was more than a symbolic gesture. It was a recognition of her enduring influence, a way to ensure that her story would be told and retold, that her determination would never fade from memory. Money passes from hand to hand, a quiet reminder that her work was never about wealth or recognition, but about the value of human dignity. Every time that bill is exchanged, it carries with it a silent question. What will you do with the freedom she fought so hard to secure? Her legacy found new life in the civil rights movement of the 20th century, where leaders like Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. walked paths she had helped to clear. They too understood that freedom was not given, but taken claimed through persistence, through refusal to accept injustice. When Rosa Parks stayed seated on that bus, she was drawing from the same well of courage that had allowed Harriet to defy the slave catchers, to risk everything for the sake of others. The marchers who crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma were walking in her footsteps, each step a declaration that the journey toward justice was not yet over. And the work did not stop there. In the quiet activism of today, her spirit lives on. When a young organizer stands up for fair wages, when a teacher ensures her students know their history, when a neighbor opens their door to someone in need, these are the small, steady acts that Harriet's life exemplified. Modern movements for racial justice, from Black Lives Matter to prison abolition, trace their lineage back to her unyielding belief in liberation. They carry forward her understanding that freedom is not just the absence of chains, but the presence of opportunity, safety, and belonging. Scholars and artists have returned to her story again and again, finding new meaning in her struggles and triumphs. Playwrights have brought her to life on stage. Filmmakers have captured her journey on screen, and poets have woven her into verse, each interpretation adding another layer to her legacy. Some have questioned whether the myths surrounding her, the tales of her supernatural intuition, her unshakable fearlessness, do justice to the real woman who must have known doubt, who must have felt the weight of her choices. But even these debates keep her memory alive, ensuring that she is not frozen in the past, but remains a living, evolving presence in our collective consciousness. Her influence stretches beyond borders, too, in movements for freedom around the world. Her name is invoked as a symbol of resistance. Women fighting for their rights in distant lands have drawn strength from her story, recognizing in her struggle a reflection of their own. The underground railroads of today, networks that help refugees, trafficking survivors, and those fleeing violence, operate in her spirit, guided by the same principle, that no one should be left behind. And yet, for all the grand ways her legacy has been honored, it is perhaps in the small, everyday moments that her presence is most deeply felt. In the parent who tells their child about her before bed, in the voter who stands in line for hours because they know their voice matters, in the friend who offers a listening ear without judgment. These are the quiet ways her lessons live on. She was not a distant hero on a pedestal, but a woman who worked with her hands, who knew the ache of exhaustion, who found joy in the simple things. The smell of turned earth in a garden, the warmth of a shared meal, the sound of a hymn sung low and soft in the darkness. Her life reminds us that courage does not always roar. Sometimes it is a whisper, a steady determination to keep going when the path is unclear. Sometimes it is the choice to turn back, risking everything to bring others to safety. Sometimes it is the patience to plant seeds, knowing you may never see them grow. As you drift toward sleep, imagine her not as a figure frozen in history, but as a presence that lingers in the world around you. The wind through the trees might carry her voice, urging you forward. The stars might shine a little brighter, reminding you that even in the deepest night, light persists. And when you wake, her legacy will still be there, waiting for you to add your own small act of courage to the countless others that keep her spirit alive. Rest now, knowing that her story is not finished. It is still being written in your life, in the lives of those around you, in the quiet, uncelebrated moments where kindness and bravery meet. Harriet Tubman's greatest gift was not just what she did, but what she showed us was possible. And as long as there are people who refuse to look away from injustice, who reach out a hand to those in need, who believe in a future brighter than the past, her light will never go out. So close your eyes and let her story settle over you like a quilt, stitched with threads of resilience and hope. Tomorrow, the work continues. But tonight, rest. You, too, are part of this long, unbroken line walking forward, one step at a time, toward the dawn. Wrapped in the comfort of these words, we'll drift together into the next part of this soothing biography. Harriet Tubman's story is often told in broad strokes. Brave conductor of the Underground Railroad fearless warrior for freedom. A woman who never lost a passenger. And while these things are true, they are only fragments of a much richer, more complicated life. As you settle into sleep, let's gently unravel some of the myths and misconceptions that have softened the edges of her truth, smoothing them down until they fit neatly into the stories we tell ourselves about heroes. One of the most persistent myths is that Harriet Tubman worked alone, a solitary figure guiding people to freedom under the cover of night. But the truth is, she was part of a vast and intricate network: abolitionists, free black communities, sympathetic Quakers, even some unlikely allies who risked everything to help. The Underground Railroad was just that. A system, not a single path, but many winding routes, safe houses, and whispered signals. Tubman relied on others just as they relied on her, moving through the world like a single stitch in a great, invisible quilt of resistance. Another story often told is that she never felt fear, that her faith made her invincible. But Tubman herself spoke of the terror that gripped her on those dangerous journeys, the way her heart pounded when slave catchers passed too close, the way her legs threatened to give out beneath her. Her courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was the choice to keep walking anyway, despite the trembling in her hands. She carried a revolver, not just to protect those she guided, but to steel her own resolve. "You'll be free or die," she would say, not as a threat, but as a quiet acknowledgement of the stakes. There's also the misconception that her work ended with emancipation, that once the Civil War was over, she faded into quiet retirement. But Tubman's fight for justice never stopped. She cared for the elderly, took in orphans, campaigned for women's suffrage, and fought for the rights of black veterans who had been promised land and dignity, only to be denied both. Her later years were not a restful sunset, but another chapter in a life of relentless advocacy. Perhaps the most overlooked part of her story is the toll it took on her body, the severe head injury she suffered as a young girl left her with lifelong pain, seizures, and visions she believed were messages from God. She wasn't just navigating the physical dangers of escape routes. She was doing so while battling dizziness, sudden unconsciousness, and debilitating headaches. And yet, she walked anyway, guided others anyway, because freedom was worth more than comfort. Then there's the way her image has been softened over time, turned into something palatable, almost gentle. The real Tubman was sharp, unyielding, and sometimes even harsh when she needed to be. She didn't coddle those she led. She demanded their courage, because hesitation could mean death for all of them. Some who followed her later admitted they had been terrified of her, of the way she held them to a standard they weren't sure they could meet. But that was the point. She knew what was at stake. And what of her personal life? The myths rarely mention her family, the husband who refused to leave with her, the nieces and nephews she rescued at great personal risk, the second marriage late in life to a man decades decades younger than her, she was not just a symbol, but a woman with loves and losses, with private griefs and quiet joys. Even the way we picture her is often wrong. The most famous photographs show her as an elderly woman wrapped in shawls, face lined with age. But when she was making her daring escapes, she was young, strong, and quick, able to move silently through the woods, to disguise herself, to outthink those hunting her. The image of the grandmotherly Tubman is comforting, but it erases the fierce, nimble woman who slipped through the night like a shadow. And then there's the way we talk about the Underground Railroad itself, as if it was a straightforward path to freedom. In truth, it was messy, improvised, and fraught with near disasters. Routes changed constantly. Trusted allies sometimes betrayed them. There were nights spent hiding in swamps, days without food, moments when escape seemed impossible. Tubman's brilliance wasn't just in her bravery, but in her adaptability, her ability to read the land, to sense danger, to make split-second decisions that meant life or death. Even the number of trips she made is often exaggerated or simplified. Some accounts say 19, others 13. What matters isn't the tally, but the fact that each journey was a fresh gamble with her life, and she didn't just guide people north. Sometimes she led them south, to places so dangerous that slave catchers wouldn't think to look. She understood that freedom wasn't always a straight line. The greatest myth of all, perhaps, is that Harriet Tubman's story belongs only to the past, that her work is finished. But the truth is, she is still here in the quiet determination of those who speak out against injustice, in the hands that reach back to pull others forward, in the stubborn belief that a better world is possible. Her legacy isn't just in what she did, but in the way she refused to accept that anything was impossible. So, as you drift toward sleep, let go of the simplified stories, the polished legends. Imagine her instead as she really was, tired, hurting, afraid, but still moving, still leading, still believing. And know that the same strength lives in you, in the small choices you make, in the quiet moments when you too refuse to look away. Rest now, wrapped in the deeper, truer story, one that isn't just about the past, but about the future still being written. Harriet Tubman's light hasn't faded. It's simply passed on, waiting for the next hands to carry it forward. Now, as we continue our gentle journey through this remarkable life, let us explore the next chapter. Harriet Tubman's life was not one of ease, but of extraordinary courage, a quiet, relentless kind that did not shout its own name, but simply moved forward, one step at a time. Through the darkest nights, she walked through forests where the trees whispered danger, crossed rivers that could have swallowed her whole, and navigated by the stars when the earth itself seemed to turn against her. And yet, she never walked alone. Even in her solitude, she carried others with her, not just those she led to freedom, but the generations yet unborn, the ones who would one day hear her story and feel the spark of her defiance in their own bones. She was not a mythical figure, though history has sometimes polished her into something smooth and distant. She was human, aching, exhausted, her body marked by the brutality of slavery, her mind haunted by the risks she took, and yet, when she could have stopped, when she could have stayed in the safety of the North, she turned back. Again and again, she returned to the land of her enslavement, guiding others along paths only she seemed to know by heart. It was as if she understood, deep in her spirit, that freedom was not a gift to be hoarded, but a light meant to be shared. Her work did not end with the Underground Railroad. When the Civil War came, she did not sit in comfort while others fought. She became a scout, a spy, a nurse, using every skill she had learned in survival to serve a cause greater than herself. And when the war ended, she did not retire into silence. She fought for women's rights, for the dignity of the elderly, for the belief that no one should be left behind. Even in her final years, when her body was frail and her voice no longer as strong, she opened her home to those in need, proving that liberation was not just a single act, but a way of living. Today, her name is spoken in classrooms, etched into history books, whispered in prayers of gratitude. Statues rise in her honor, and children learn her story as an example of what one person can do. But Harriet Tubman was not just a lesson. She was a woman who refused to accept that the world could not be changed. When people say her name, they are not just remembering the past. They are calling on the same spirit that guided her, the same stubborn hope that refuses to die. In quiet moments, if you listen, you can almost hear her not as a distant hero, but as a presence, a reminder that courage does not always roar. Sometimes it is simply the next step taken in the dark. Sometimes it is the hand reaching back, the voice saying, "Keep going, asterisk." Her legacy is not trapped in the 19th century. It walks beside us whenever someone stands up against injustice, whenever someone chooses kindness over indifference, whenever someone believes, against all odds, that a better world is possible. And so, as you settle into the soft embrace of sleep, let Harriet Tubman's story rest gently in your mind, not as a finished tale, but as a living one. You are part of it now, just as she is part of yours. The same stars that guided her still shine above you. The same quiet strength that carried her through the night lives in you, too, in the way you care, in the way you hope, in the way you keep going even when the path is unclear. Close your eyes and imagine for a moment that you are walking under those stars, not alone, but alongside all those who have dared to believe in freedom. The air is cool, the night is still, and the journey is long, but step by step, breath by breath, you move forward, just as she did, just as we all must do. Sleep now, wrapped in the knowledge that the work of love and liberation is never truly over. And yet, there is peace in knowing you are part of something so much larger than yourself. Harriet Tubman's light has not gone out. It glows softly in you, in the choices you will make tomorrow, in the quiet ways you, too, will change the world. Rest well, dear listener. The night is gentle, and morning will come not as an ending, but as another step in the long, beautiful walk toward freedom.